Ingenious, isn't it, Mr. Bunt?
Scorpio, you're totally mad.
I wouldn't point fingers, you jerk.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Springfield Googolplex, the movie podcast for Simpson fans, brought to you by ThatShelf.com. Every episode, we talk about a movie parodied on The Simpsons. Maybe it was The Simpsons that introduced us to the film, or maybe when we finally saw it, we realized, hey, that's where that Simpson joke came from. Regardless, each week we pick one that one of us hasn't seen or hasn't seen in a while, watch it, and come together to discuss. I am your host, Adam Scholes, and joining me as always is the pussy galore to my odd job, my co-host, Nate Storing. Do you like that? I'm getting you back for making me say pussy so much at your wedding.
Yes, I did do that, actually. The owl and the pussycat. So, okay, do Pussy Galore and Oddjob have a relationship in this movie? Best of friends?
They're both hench people.
Hench people. That's true. So we're like, yeah.
Possibly?
Yeah.
We both work for the same employer, I guess.
Yes.
I also realized, Nate, that you have a great Goldfinger name. Like, I want to now I just want to say your name, like, Nate Storing. Wah, wah, wah. Like, you're very lucky. There's not a lot. You have the perfect amount of syllables to Goldfinger it.
Yeah. I had not thought of that.
Yeah. So there
I
you
even
go.
get that O in the last name.
Yeah, exactly. Like,
perfectly.
it works really, really well. So anyway, from now on, whenever I reference you, I think I'm going to have to go, Nate Storing. Wah, wah, wah.
Lucky me.
And normally, if we were recording this at our normal record time, I would be enjoying an ice-cold martini. But seeing as it's 9:30 in the morning, and I don't have a drinking problem like the titular character. Well, I guess not the titular character. Well, no. It's not James Bond's Goldfinger. Yeah, anyway. I'm drinking tea, which, of course, longtime James Bond fans would know is a travesty. James Bond hates tea. He thinks it's disgusting and always wants coffee, whereas I feel the other way. So, how about you?
He likes coffee. Oh,
yes,
so un-British.
I know. He refuses. He hates tea. This is like in the books. He talks about how tea is terrible. And in the first Roger Moore movie, Live and Let Die, he has a very, very fancy, for the time, espresso maker, which he makes M a coffee and M makes some disparaging remark and all that stuff.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess one of the whole things with Bond is like introducing things to people on screen that they've never seen before.
Of course.
Like particularly leading up to, the 90s and the 2000s where it's like then we have the internet and there's no such thing as something that you've never seen before, really.
It's kind of why the movies don't work the same now that like they used to. But Well, I guess we should say this week we watched Guy Hamilton's Goldfinger from 1964, which you might remember from such Simpson episodes as possibly the very first episode, Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire, Season 2's Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?, Season 3's Homer Defined, Season 4's Itchy and Scratchy the Movie, Season 5's Cape Fear, Season 6's Who Shot Mr. Burns Part 1, Season 7's The Simpsons 138th episode spectacular and possibly scenes from the class struggle in Springfield, Season 8's You Only Move Twice, Season 10's Homer to the Max, They Saved Lisa's Brain, and possibly Monty Can't Buy Me Love, Season 11's Little Big Mom and It's a Bad, Mad, Mad, Mad Marge, and possibly Season 13's A Hunka Hunka Burns in Love.
That was like a tongue twister this time.
Yeah, no kidding.
A lot of complicated titles.
Out of curiosity, how much of these are just because the couch gag is the James Bond couch gag?
Well, so I didn't give that one to this movie. I gave that to Dr. No.
Okay, so there you go. So these are all like straight up Goldfinger references, not just like James Bond references.
That's right.
Wow.
Any general James Bond references that can't be pinned to a movie go to Dr. No.
Okay, interesting.
But so in the later seasons, a lot of these, we'll get into it, are actually mostly references to the score.
Right.
Using it as a shorthand for usually like gadgets.
Right.
So,
Okay, cool. Well, because this is a James Bond episode, we are in danger of it becoming a 4-hour episode. So I'm not going to waste any time, and let's just jump right into the episode. This week, we watched Who Shot Mr. Burns, Part 1, Season 6, Episode 25, directed by Jeffrey Lynch, written by the great, and friend of the show, Bill Oakley, and hopefully soon to be friend of the show, Josh Weinstein, and guest stars Tito Puente. Air date May 21st, 1995, which means this is the 30th anniversary of the episode.
Yeah, that was sort of the inspiration for doing Goldfinger, was really this anniversary and looking at all of the references from Who Shot Mr. Burns Part 1 and saying, which one is actually substantial enough to do a whole episode about? And this is pretty much the only one. There's a lot of little ones, but this is like the real parody that's in there.
Yeah, it's funny watching it with that lens. I was like, oh, they're actually doing some surprisingly detailed Goldfinger references in this, which is kind of cool. Just for those who may not remember, this is the episode where Mr. Burns is shot. Everyone in Springfield has a motive because he's a jerk. And it's the only 2-part cliffhanger episode in the first 13 seasons. And sort of famously, it was a big deal that they did this cliffhanger, and they were taking betting odds on who the murderer was. They had false endings and false scripts for season 2. And
they had like a competition.
Yeah.
Where you could like call in and say who you thought shot Mr. Burns. And it famously was kind of, the competition was kind of a flop. Like there was like one person who won, but it was like an older woman who didn't watch the show and guessed that it was, and I think she was just like, it's the baby.
Right. Yeah. And I think, too, like David Merkin talks in the commentary. I can't remember if it's for this episode or part 2. But he basically says, like, we had a bunch of fake scripts. We tried to leak them and nobody wanted them. And so they were like, eventually we just literally gave them to the news outlets and all this stuff. So I don't necessarily think this had the Who Shot JR effect that they were hoping for, because it was just an animated sitcom. But certainly it's an interesting premise, and it's arguably one of the higher concept premises the show had done up until this point.
Yeah, totally. And super memorable as a fan. Like, I mean, this is one of the biggest deals, I feel like, in the first 13 seasons as a fan of the show. The stakes of it feel really big. They successfully amp it up beyond what the show usually does in terms of what the conflict is, I guess.
Totally. What's your relationship with this episode? Like, so 1995, we were pretty young when it originally aired, but do you have like memories of this from its syndicated days or DVD days?
Yeah, so I mean, I definitely remember it from the syndicated days, and it's that classic problem that you have even with like Batman 66, where it's like, you'll get the part 1, and then if you miss the part 2, you'll just have to wait like months for it to roll back around. And so I definitely remember that happening a few times, but I don't know whether I was already really deep into the show when it first aired. It probably would have been right around this time that I started paying attention. And so I don't remember specifically like the cliffhanger and then like the resolution, like experiencing that firsthand. But I do feel like the advertising for this was everywhere. Totally. And I do feel like I remember the amping up of what this 2-part episode was around that time. But what about you?
Well, this is one of the episodes that I definitely had on my like 8-hour homemade Simpsons VHS that I taped episodes off of CBC Global and Teletoon, because as we have discussed earlier, there was a glorious time in the early 2000s where there was like 3 hours of The Simpsons on every single night, and I would tape it so that I could rewatch it. So I watched this episode quite a bit, but as you say, they didn't necessarily always air them in the proper order, so I don't know that I actually had episode 2 recorded.
Right.
So I watched episode 1, like part 1, quite a few times, but I think episode 2 I didn't really get to revisit until the DVD came out. And of course, long-term fans know that this season 6, is the season that came in the dreaded Homer Simpson's head box. So when the DVDs came out, they did the like limited edition, like it came in a plastic shell, and it completely upended what they had done for the previous 5 seasons. So if you have them all on your shelf, it looked awful, and there was so much backlash that they then released a slip cover you could put on it to make it look like the other versions, which I think I actually have it in my office here somewhere. But then the funny thing was, of course, they continued this trend for the next, 5 discs with the rest of the family members. And because I already had the Homer head, I went on to get the rest of the plastic shells for the remaining seasons before they switched back to the standard cardboard. So it's like, if you look
did you get slip covers for all of them?
No, because, so this was what they did, was they sold... You could buy either the standard version or the plastic head version. And so I just got the plastic head version. Right. But it means that like my shelf is just like a melange of, it literally takes up a whole shelf, because then after they stopped with the family, they did this thing where everything came in the standard sort of DVD case, but the limited edition version had a 3D cutout of a Simpsons character sort of attached to it.
Right.
Again, that was the limited edition thing. So it makes it, the standard DVD case would maybe be like an inch thick, but once you add this face on, it becomes like 3 inches. God. On my DVD shelf, there's literally an entire shelf that is just for the Simpsons box sets, because they take up so much goddamn room.
Good Lord. Yeah, I rebought like all the DVDs recently for the show, and I was able to get all the just like the simple ones. So I have no heads
I'm very
in
jealous,
my collection.
But But anyway, maybe if I ever sell them, the resale value will be higher because they were quote unquote limited editions.
Right, right, indeed. I did feel like rewatching this episode too, it is this interesting moment where it's an overlap between Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein coming in as showrunners, but they wrote this episode or sort of like led the writing of this episode. And then you also have the end of David Merkin still involved and I think helping to conceptualize this sort of two-part thing.
Yeah.
But for me, that's maybe like the sweet spot.
Totally.
That brings together all of the things I love most about the show.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about it in an episode I think that we will have already aired, but we haven't recorded yet, maybe. But I really love the sort of cynicism that David Merkin brought to the show. And whenever one of those episodes that either he wrote or he was the showrunner on comes up, I'm always like, yes. This is like what I really think of when I think of The Simpsons, is a little bit more dark and sharp.
Yes.
But then the Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein, like, you know, attention to characters and especially the side characters and the dynamics of the town and like a little bit more wacky zany. Like all of that together is like the perfect package. So this really brings it all together for me.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't think I appreciated what a great episode this actually was until this rewatch. Like rewatching it, I was like, damn, like as you say, like it's really well scripted. It's got a actually kind of intriguing murder mystery, which like is very much my shit. It's got really beautiful cinematography. Like Jeffrey Lynch knocked it out of the park on this in a way that I was like, I never really was paying attention to until this rewatch. So it's just, I'll be curious if I enjoy part 2 as much, but was just, sort of pleasantly surprised by it. Because again, this is one that I watched a lot as a teenager, but I don't think was sort of watching it with the same eye. Mm-hmm. And on this rewatch sort of appreciated so many more things that I think by doing this show, I'm more sort of attuned to. You also sort of pointed out too, the Skinners and Chalmers of it all.
Right. Well, this is the sort of Bill Oakley, Josh Weinstein bit, is like you have this interaction between Skinner and Chalmers in this episode that feels very much like a rehearsal of the steamed hams thing.
Totally. Awful school is awful rich.
Yeah, exactly. He has a newspaper that has that as the headline, and he's showing it to Chalmers, but he's covering the awful part of awful school. And Chalmers says,
"Now, what's that say under your hand there?"
Oh, it's an unrelated article.
It's an unrelated article. Within the banner headline.
Yeah.
Which I think this is the episode where I get yes, which is like one of my favorite quotes that I do all the time.
Yeah. It's so funny to think that your number one Simpson quote is literally the word yes. But it is. Like, for literally the last 20 years, I feel like that is the thing you quote the most.
Yeah.
Speaking of references, what is the reference, Nate? Like, talk me through the Goldfinger-ness of Who Shot Mr. Burns.
Yeah. So I feel like they deploy it super well here, and for a couple reasons. It's not really a James Bond reference, which is one of the interesting things. It's very much a reference to this movie, and more so the villain, Goldfinger, Auric Goldfinger. Mm-hmm. So when we finally are getting to hear like what Mr. Burns is actually planning to block out the sun, the way he explains it to Smithers is a parody of the scene right before the climax of this movie, where Auric Goldfinger is explaining his plan to a bunch of goons.
The classic James Bond villain, I'm going to now monologue and explain my whole plan for some unknown, for plot exposition reasons, but in a way that would never happen in real life.
Right, totally. And so the way the scene plays out is they're in Mr. Burns' office, and Mr. Burns like goes over to his desk and fiddles with some knobs, and then the floor opens up and you get a scale model of Springfield, and he shows how this thing is going to pop out of the mountain and block the sun.
Since the beginning of time, man has yearned to destroy the sun. I will do the next best thing. Block it out.
That exact sequence happens in this movie with the model and the knobs and all of that.
What was so fascinating, because I always struggle with how to watch these. I'm like, should I watch the movie first, then the episode, or the episode first and then the movie? But in this case, I watched the movie or rewatched the movie. I've seen Goldfinger many times. Rewatch the movie first and then rewatch the episode. And so what I was struck by was like, this is why I talk about like the level of detail. In that sequence in the Bond picture, one of the henchmen is standing on the floor that's opening up and sort of has to do this leap off so that, because the floor is literally disappearing out from under him. And Smithers does the exact same sort of choreography, for lack of a better term. And it's such a small moment in the film, but kind of noticeable. And same with like Burns is twiddling knobs in a way that Goldfinger actually does. Like, so I was just sort of struck by, this is not just like maybe it's kind of a quasi reference because, you know, it's just a secret henchman villain thing. Right. No, like this is very clearly a reference to that moment in the film because of the level of detail.
Even Mr. Burns' stance, like he sort of stands at one moment with his legs apart and his arms behind his back. I feel like that's even like a reference specifically to Goldfinger in this scene. So it's very cool. Like, again, I love it when there's this level of detail, and it really rewards both rewatching the movie and also rewatching the episode again and again to kind of like spot all of those little details.
Totally.
Going back to something I said earlier, the reason why this reference is so cool is that I feel like it successfully raises the stakes of this episode. Mm-hmm. You know, we've all seen Mr. Burns be a jerk before, you know, like he's done lots of mean things and he's been connected to lots of other movie villains over the first 6 seasons up to this point. But this sort of like persuasively makes you feel like, oh, maybe he's gone too far this time.
Right.
You know, he's going full Goldfinger, full supervillain. And it sets up the stakes of who shot Mr. Burns and the 2-part thing really, really well. Because it's like, you know, we covered You Only Live Twice, right? The other big Bond parody on the show. It was our very first episode. And even though theoretically the stakes of that are very high, it's a very like fun, silly episode, right? Totally. And it doesn't really like make you feel like, oh no, what's going to happen? Right. Whereas,
well, and in that case, too, the villain is so charming and funny and Albert Brooksy that like he doesn't really feel like a supervillain. Like he's clearly doing supervillain things, but we like him. He's not meant to be seen as evil.
Right. And they like smartly take it out of Springfield, which I think lowers the stakes. Yeah. Right. The fact that this is happening in Springfield and you get to see everyone's reaction to it and just like tensions boiling among all these characters that you know is part of what makes it feel like such a big deal. And this scene is sort of integral to that construction. It's a very cool parody in that way.
Yeah. What other references did you find in this episode? I mean, I clocked a few other parodies, but, you know, with you being the master of the database, what else did you catch?
Okay, so there are only actually a couple that are confirmed, and there's a whole bunch of mystery references.
Okay.
So the two that are like 100% are Singing in the Rain. So after Mr. Burns blocks out the sun, he's sort of dancing through the dark streets and like climbs up on a lamppost exactly like Gene Kelly in that famous dance scene in that movie.
And that actually leads me to, I don't know if you know the answer, but he has that line like, hello, lamppost, what you know? And I came to watch your power flow. And I'm like, is that something?
It's a reference to a song.
Hello, lamppost, what you knowin'? I come to watch your flowers growing.
Okay, that's what I assumed, but I didn't know the song, so I was like, okay, this is clearly a parody or a reference or something.
Right, it's a reference to a song that I don't think has really withstood the test of time. But yeah, it's not a movie reference, so it's not of interest to me.
Okay, great.
Okay, and then the other one that's like really clear is the end credit music is JFK.
Yes.
Right, it's very clearly a reference to the score of that movie, and they call out JFK on the commentary, and I couldn't quite figure out if there are other JFK references in this episode or not.
I rewatched it recently, and the biggest things you would take away from JFK is maybe the cinematography, but more specifically like the editing. Like that's what makes JFK the masterpiece that it is just how well it's cut together. And I guess the score, the John Williams score. Based on my recent reviewing of that film, I don't think they're doing much outside of the music, but it is a weird thing that they would use that music as a reference and then not do any other. I guess it's the idea of like assassination is tied to JFK.
Oh, yeah.
But JFK isn't a murder mystery, whereas like...
Right.
And what they're riffing on is...
It's kind of a murder mystery in a sense. It's just that you don't know all the characters.
I guess so, yeah. But what I was going to say is that you would think that what they would reference is Dallas, because that's what they're riffing on is Who Shot JR. So it is an interesting choice to go the JFK route and not do anything else JFK-y, but...
Right. Well, and I think on the commentary, Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein talk about how much they love JFK and how they were like influenced by it. And like they love those types of movies, the conspiracy theory sort of movies.
Yeah, totally.
And so I'm wondering if it's just like a more subtle like inspiration, but not really a parody per se, or like there's no direct references, but the DNA is kind of in this episode in some way. So anyway, that's a question for a writer one of these days. Another one that I feel pretty confident about, but is an addition from Springfield Googolplex, is Psycho. And this is something that I've noticed more and more is that they do actually use the Psycho score, or sort of like their sound-alike of the Psycho score, as a sort of stand-in a lot.
Totally.
Right?
Totally.
So when Mr. Burns asks Homer, who the devil are you? When he comes to the office because he's pissed off that he can't remember his name and he finally loses it, you get the sort of violin stings. Yeah, exactly, as he runs towards him. So like that feels pretty concrete to me. But again, a lot of those score parodies are not on the internet anywhere. They don't get picked up in the same way that the visual ones do.
Totally.
So that's kind of cool.
If it's not referencing the movie directly, it's obviously referencing that sort of idea of what that score represents and goes on to represent. We've talked about this before, how they sort of use movie scores or movie score sound-alikes to then sort of stand in for, we want to kind of give a certain tone or whatever.
Right. Planet of the Apes,
the Cape Fear, Psycho. Those are sort of the big three, I would say.
Well, and Goldfinger.
And well,
I would argue
we're going to get into it, aren't we?
Yeah.
What are some of the mystery references?
Yeah. So this is one that, since we've covered it, that I was curious about. Dr. Strangelove. I feel like there might be a Dr. Strangelove reference in here, and it's after they set up the oil well, right? Mr. Burns, this is another funny thing. Mr. Burns drinks their milkshake, right?
Oh, he sure does.
He steals their oil by undercutting the oil well under the school, just like in There Will Be Blood. But anyway...
so There Will Be Blood is actually a reference to Who Shot Mr. Burns.
That's right, exactly. That's what the real
P.T. Anderson ripped this off. Okay, great.
Yes, yeah. So when that happens, right, and they're getting ready to start the well, Mr. Burns says to Smithers,
Soon that mighty apparatus will burst forth with its precious fluid. Almost sexual, isn't it, Smithers?
So precious fluids feels like it's got to be a nod to Dr. Strangelove. In the movie, they do say precious bodily fluids is the actual line, but like, given that they love that movie, it's got to be.
And within the context of what he's saying, it kind of feels like it could be,
Here's one that's a question mark. A Streetcar Named Desire. There's a moment in this where the town is all together. I think they're just finding out that the oil under the school is not going to work out.
Burns
and Willie tears his shirt in a way where it's hanging off of one of his shoulders, and it looks exactly like Stanley in the famous Stella scene in this movie. But is it enough that you would call it a reference? Because otherwise, what else is it trying to do, right? Like, it doesn't feel like it stands alone as something. It's just like a moment that happens.
Yeah, Willie's done this a couple times throughout the show, but I don't know if this is the first instance or not. But it does feel like it's maybe a nod more than a reference, if that makes sense. Like,
it's not a parody. It's just like a little moment where the way the shirt is ripped looks exactly like how it's ripped in that scene. So I'm kind of like, I think it's probably a little nod, but it's very subtle. Okay. Mr. Burns stomping on the model. Is it a monster movie parody? It sure looks like Godzilla to me, in terms of like his little hands are kind of up in like a Godzilla pose, you know? So I feel like that's probably a pretty safe bet. But again, it's more of a little nod of almost a self-conscious thing because Mr. Burns knows what he's doing.
Right.
Okay, so here's some true mysteries. So when Mr. Burns removes Homer from his office and he's being dragged away, Homer says this line in a very distinctive way where he goes, "Oh, you're dead, Burns."
Oh, you're a dead man, Burns. Oh, you're dead. You're dead, Burns.
That feels like it's got to be a reference to something. It kind of feels like in the vein of Goodfellas or something like that.
Yeah.
But I don't know what it is.
Yeah, I agree. It definitely feels like they're riffing on something. I just don't know what.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and similarly, my sort of contribution to this is the design of Drunken Smithers at the meeting at the end, when he's obviously all disheveled and he's wearing like the color specifically of his outfit. And I feel like it must be referencing something like, again, is it The Lost Weekend? Is it going back to their classic? I don't know, but, and maybe it's just, no, we just wanted to make him look drunk. But there's something about it that to me feels like, is this just modeled after a specific like moment in a specific film of a famous, like, is it called Day of Wine and Roses? There's
Day of Wine and Roses.
Or the Jack Lemmon movie where he plays a drunk. I don't know. I feel like they're doing something there, but I just don't know what it is.
Yeah, totally. So, Adam, what were some of your top 5 favorite moments from this episode? Because, again, I think we could go on forever and ever about how much we love this episode. There's so many good moments. But, yeah, what stands out to you?
nailing this down to 5 was tricky. I love the opening sequence with the P alliteration with the power plant projections.
Hey, Porter, pass it on.
Pasadena, promptly.
Package parcel processing, pronto.
Forgot Prendergast, profoundly pressing package of power plant profit projections for Pete Porter and Pasadena.
Priority.
Precisely.
You know, it's one of those moments where, like, The Simpsons, again, we always talk about how sometimes they will go off in random directions briefly.
Right.
That isn't necessarily tied to the plot, but it's just one of those great little cartoony things where the show is more like a cartoon than it is a sitcom, I guess is the way I would put it.
Right, right.
So I love that. The really, really great shot design. In that sequence, they keep cutting in closer and closer when they're going through the alliterations. There's the close-up on the cigar being lit. The lighting in the sequence where Burns is sort of unveiling his plan to Smithers is, like, beautiful. There's, like, this really harsh shadow on them. When Burns reveals at the town hall meeting that he's got a gun, they've got, like, this nice low angle. I think it might also be slightly Dutched. And then the thing that I think actually works really, really, really well and is sort of the most cinematic is when they keep cutting away to the various clues at the end, sort of leading up to give you a sense of, like, who could possibly be the killer. And the one that always sticks in my mind is there's a close-up of the cigar box blowing in the wind and, like, an empty bullet casing sort of rolls away. That whole
sequence at the end is amazing.
Yeah, it's just like, I don't think the show gets enough credit for how cinematic it can be when it wants to be. You know, everybody just sort of thinks of the show as it's a funny cartoon. But, like, when they want to flex their muscles, they can really do some incredible stuff. And I think this is a perfect example of that.
Yeah, and I think, you know, since our podcast is all about, like, the movie parodies, like, I think often when people think about the cinematic moments, they think of the movie parodies on the show. But there are some, like, genuine, like, they came up with this idea.
Totally.
You know, and, like, this final sequence in this episode is one of those things where it feels like they just made this out of whole cloth, and it is very cinematic and really satisfying animation.
Yeah. My other 3 favorite things, the candy bit when they're eating the candy. It's what, you know, I think this is a common thing on podcasts. People hate when people chew on microphone. I actually really love the performance of them talking while pretending to eat candy.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, look, there's a photo in here.
Yes, I believe that little Maggie Simpson, the baby who found my precious teddy bear boo-boo.
And then the reveal on the sour quince log is great. And then
candy.
This is, again, I love the sound on The Simpsons. I always want to, like, shout out the sound on The Simpsons. There's a really great, quiet, subtle nerd from Nelson when Lisa comes on stage. That is just, like, again, if you're not paying close enough attention, you might not hear it, but it's just, like, it's a great sort of, like, classic school thing of the school bully taking advantage. Here's my opportunity. I'm going to call him out on it.
Right. It's one of those things that I love on the show, too, where it's just, like, it's kids being kids. Like, it's not a clever joke, but it's just funny. And it really feels like, Nelson's a kid, and he's going to do the, like, crappy thing when the school nerd comes on stage.
And then the last thing is just, like, so much great Burns stuff. Like, because this is the episode where they really let him be truly evil, you get some great line readings, like 3 p.m. And, like, the rolled R's is so good. And then also I love the way when he's smashing stuff.
Being Godzilla.
Being Godzilla, yeah. Take that, Bolorama. Take that, Convenience Mart. It's a Burnsism, and I love when they do that sort of stuff.
Take that, nuclear power plant.
Fiddlesticks. Yeah, exactly. It's just, it's great. Harry Shearer gets to really shine as Burns in this episode.
Yeah, totally.
How about for you? What are your top 5?
Okay, so I actually ordered these. Okay, so great. My number 5, Depressed Smithers was watching a fake Comedy Central show called Pardon My Zinger, which just absolutely nails the vibe of those types of shows. The kind of, like, whose line is it anyway type thing, I guess.
Totally,
But Pardon My Zinger is such a great title. From the same scene with, you know, the sort of town hall scene. I don't even remember who says this, but someone
I think
goes,
it's Flanders.
Oh, yeah, it is. Is it Flanders? It goes,
I'd like to hear from Sideshow Mel.
I love that, too.
It's that kind of radio play level exposition of being like, we need to explain why Sideshow Mel is now going to say something. But
also it's just, like, the humor of, like, why Sideshow Mel? Why do we need his opinion?
Right. The town leader, Sideshow Mel. Okay. Bart, at one point, they're at home talking about the situation, and Bart says,
Burns needs some serious booster fazoo, right, Dad?
Yeah.
So, okay, and actually this could maybe fall under a potential parody as well, or movie reference. Bustafazoo is like completely made up as far as I can tell from The Simpsons, right? And since has become an internet thing among the youths, apparently.
Right.
It's like an online saying, right? But I think what it's referencing is Bafangul.
Right, yeah.
Which is, of course, like an Italian-American thing, but also is used very obviously in Godfather Part 2.
Yeah.
When Connie gets mad at Michael and says, Bafangul.
Yeah.
Right? So I kind of wonder if that's a play on that and the sort of just general like Italian-American sayings, right?
Totally.
Sort of like butchering Italian.
Well, and I love when Lisa, shortly thereafter, Lisa's on the phone with Tito Puente, and she has the line of,
yeah, I'd like to settle his hash too.
And I don't know what that means, but even as like a teenager, I just thought that was such a funny phrase, and it's especially funny coming out of Lisa.
Right. The relationship between Lisa and Tito Puente in this episode is like another pretty funny thing.
No sense, but it's so good.
Yes, what a great choice for a guest star in an episode where it's like they could have done so many things, and this is just one of those ones where it's like it feels very shoehorned in, but in a really funny way. Okay, number 2, Mr. Burns saying, "Since the beginning of time, man has yearned to destroy the sun." As though that's like just an accepted fact that man has always wanted to destroy the sun. And of course, that's in the middle of his Goldfinger speech. And then finally, this is a simple one. I guess Skinner actually has a couple things that I reference all the time in this episode. So there's yes. And then there's also, oh, mercy, which is also a great line reading from Principal Skinner. And that I think is my number 1 from this episode. Because again, I use it all the time. You've probably heard it on this podcast.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I'm going to speed round a few of my other favorite things or like great line readings. Again, we could talk about this episode ad nauseum.
Literally, we have a list on here that is an entire screen worth of just like quotes and other stuff from this episode. But yeah.
Well, one of the things I was thinking of, do we need to switch up our censoring sound from the power plant crow? For those who weren't aware of what we were using, that is what it is. It's the power plant crow. But should we start using pipe organs like they do in this episode?
I think it might extend the length of our episodes quite a bit.
That's true.
I did also like the boink from...
yeah, well, thank you. Yes, I was proud of that.
That's also a good one.
The grandpa jump scare and Lisa's line reading of, sorry, grandpa, it's just for a second there, it looked like dad had melted.
Yeah.
Similarly with grandpa, hey, the lamp's running away, so long, lamp. Sir, a lot of people are stroking their guns. He robbed the school of Tito. I mean, there's so many great moments. But the one thing I wanted to sort of circle back to, this whole mystery idea, is that one of the things that I think is really clever is that they make it very clear that everyone in town is a suspect except for Marge, because we see Marge at the moment of the murder. And so it's like, that's one of those sort of clever, I don't know why I like it, but I'm like, oh, that's a nice little detail that they don't make it so open-ended. I mean, yes, everyone in town is a suspect, and they sort of lay forth the sort of most obvious sort of 5 people or whatever based on those clues that we talked about earlier. But it's just like a nice little detail that they realize we have to sort of have some moral grounding here, and a character that we can rely is safe. And it makes sense that it's Marge.
Yeah, totally. And it is funny because they went to all the trouble that like, not only can you kind of like figure out who the most likely subject is, but I believe they also layered in clues so that you can actually rule out characters based on, you know, where they were, what kind of weapon they had. Like, you can actually figure out who did it. It's just that no one went to the trouble of actually doing that, unfortunately. Yeah. Which may speak to the time too, because it's like, like, how would you have done that? Like, you I guess you could have like taped it on VHS and then gone back and looked at the freeze frames, or like caught it on, I guess maybe it was airing over the summer, but like it would have been pretty hard at that point to actually figure out the mystery.
And it speaks to what we talked about with Bill, the pre-internet or early internet era of like, if this were happening today, the mystery probably would have been solved within 15 minutes of it airing.
But because Reddit would have done it.
Yeah, exactly, right? But because, Reddit would have probably, accused... Anyway, we're not going to, yeah, exactly. But all this is to say is that, because of when it was airing, yes, there were Simpson bulletin boards and news groups, but it wasn't the same sort of like hive mind mentality that they could have today. So I think that's interesting. And then that leads me to my final favorite thing that I want to point out before we jump into the movie, which is like one of the last lines of the episode. Well, I couldn't possibly solve this mystery. Can you? And then Wiggum's beautiful, like you think he's talking to the audience, but then they give that wonderful button of cutting to Wiggum.
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. I mean,
It's my job, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's one of your favorites, which is the sort of rug pull, like switcheroo joke.
Yeah, exactly.
Where you think they're doing one thing, and that's funny, but then they are actually doing another thing, which is even funnier. Yeah. Such a good episode. But on that note, should we talk about the movie?
Yeah, let's get into it. Nate, how would you sum this movie up in a sentence?
It's always hard with Bond movies, because the plots are so nonsensical. All right.
Well, the plots, it's kind of like, you already alluded to whose line is it anyway. What is the line? The games are made up and the points don't matter or something like that?
Right,
with James Bond, it's like, the plots don't matter. It's like the Hitchcock thing. The plots are, they're MacGuffins. They're just motivation to go from set piece to set piece.
Right. I think the difference between Hitchcock and Bond is that Hitchcock is like, it's this very simple thing. All you need to know is this. I'm not going to tell you anything else. It's just like the doodad that everyone needs to get. Right. Yeah. Whereas Bond is like, let me tell you all of the little details of the plot, but just so you know, none of it matters.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Okay. So, all right, I'll give it a shot. International man of mystery James Bond is tasked with investigating a gold smuggling ring and gets more than he bargained for.
Okay, there you go. That is the loose threads of the plot, essentially.
Right.
I mean, you could talk a little bit more about Goldfinger's actual plot, but it's very absurd.
It's so ludicrous.
But though I will say it is changed from the original novel and probably changed for the better because the novel's plot is even more ludicrous. So, okay, well, Nate managed to grab our plot synopsis tonight. We always like to grab them from interesting sources. And this one comes from the Criterion Laserdisc from 1991, which was in fact eventually recalled. Famously, they put out the first three films, Dr. No, From Russia with Love, and Goldfinger, and then they were recalled because the commentaries contained some stuff that was maybe it's pretty
dicey.
Tame. It is actually pretty tame if you listen to them, but basically is why subsequent commentary tracks featured that sort of disclaimer on the DVD being like, the opinions expressed in these commentaries do not reflect those of the producers or whatever it is.
Right.
But this Criterion Laserdisc is very famous as a result. So we're going to read the plot synopsis from there. Goldfinger. Arguably the best of all the James Bond films, features an outrageous plot with a very realistic sense of danger. This third James Bond adventure, the first of the Globetrotters, takes 007 from the sun-soaked pleasure pools of Miami Beach to England's rural golfing fairways, Switzerland's treacherous alpine highways, and then back to Kentucky, USA, home of Sour Mash Bourbon, thoroughbreds, and the biggest bank in the world, Fort Knox. Goldfinger features perhaps the most memorable villain of the entire Bond series, Auric Goldfinger, with his fantastic plot to destroy America's Fort Knox gold repository with an atomic device, yada yada yada. Goldfinger has the most alluring gallery of women ever seen in the series. Nate, this is way too long. I'm not going to finish this. The episode is already going to be too long. This is basically a novel here.
This is the problem with the Laserdisc descriptions, is they're all like this, where they're like, oh shit, we have a bigger thing to fill.
Yeah, we've got a 12-inch disc we got to fill up. Yeah, exactly. We don't have enough special features yet.
Yeah, I think that first paragraph covers most of it. The rest of it is really just about like all of the different characters and blah, 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 blah. But you get the idea.
So, Nate, what is your relationship with Goldfinger?
Yeah, my relationship with Goldfinger, like, I'm definitely late in coming to this. I think we've talked about this probably in the very first episode, but I did not grow up with Bond. And very much like my Bond was probably Daniel Craig more than anything.
Okay.
Because even as a kid, like, I don't really think I watched a lot of the Pierce Brosnan movies. I don't really know why.
Right.
Maybe it was my parents thought I was too young for them when they were coming out and that kind of thing. But like, Pierce Brosnan is not really my Bond. So I kind of like retroactively went back and rewatched a lot of the Bond stuff. And I do like Sean Connery as Bond. For me, it's like, the three that I actually care about are probably like Craig, Brosnan, and Connery.
Right. That makes sense.
But yeah, like Goldfinger, I was very late coming to it. I feel like maybe even during the pandemic was like when we actually went back and watched all of the Connery Bonds in order.
Okay.
And that's my most vivid memory of the movie.
Right.
And before that, I probably saw it at some point, but I don't really remember.
Interesting.
So definitely very late coming to this movie. But I know you have a different story. So what's your background?
Well, I mean, we kind of touched on it in the You Only Live Twice episode, but that was ages ago at this point. So just to reiterate, like it was hard for me to figure out, but I'm pretty sure the genesis of it was that GoldenEye 007 comes out for the N64. I play that. I think it's super cool. I want to learn what is James Bond. My dad, who was obviously growing up in that era, was sort of like, oh, it's this movie series. Why don't you check them out? And I'm going to assume that we started with Goldfinger because that's basically where everybody starts when you're sort of introducing people to James Bond.
You don't want to start with Dr. No because it's much slower and is missing a lot of the key elements and all of that kind of thing. And I think I did see Dr. No before Goldfinger.
Interesting. Okay. That is interesting. And so that was the thing. Like, and we talked about this before, like, I then became obsessed with James Bond. I went as James Bond for Halloween one year, which is a ridiculous costume. But because of the era that I was growing up and the way you could watch these was you had to physically go to Blockbuster and rent whatever they had. I did not watch them in order. There were a bunch that I never saw until I was in university. But Goldfinger was absolutely my favorite as a kid. I remember getting it for Christmas, like probably when I was like 9 or 10 years old, getting the VHS, watching that like over and over again. So I've seen this movie a lot. And the funny thing is that when I too recently went back and sort of did my rewatch of the entire series, not just the Connery ones, I went back and looked at sort of like my Letterboxd review and I was like, oh, I didn't really enjoy this. I found it to be a bit of a slog.
Interesting.
So when I was going to watch it for this one, I was like, oh boy, like I didn't like this very much the last time. And I don't know if it was just like when I was watching it or because I had enough martini in me or because I'm a dad now, but I was surprised by how much I enjoyed my rewatch this time. Like I was actually like fully engaged, really vibing with it. But yeah, I mean, it is sort of the perfect beginner's James Bond, like entry point to the series if you're not gonna start in the Craig era, which is what I think most kids would probably do now. Like you would just sort of ignore these earlier.
And honestly, maybe for the best. Well, let's put it this way. Not that you should ignore the earlier Bonds, but just that it is a great entry point because you get a very quick origin of the character. Most of the movies are really, really great. And then you can go back and explore more because there are lots of other good movies from that series, but it is just a clean entry point. So.
But the thing I think that makes this one so special, and we'll obviously get into it, is that this is sort of the definitive Bond film. You know, the first two Bond movies don't actually follow the pattern that the rest of the series will sort of follow to come. This is the one that really sets that pattern, that introduces the gadgets, introduces the cars, introduces the like women with double entendre names, introduces the globetrotting. Like this is sort of the culmination of all of those elements, and every film that sort of follows is going to use this film as the blueprint, not From Russia with Love, not Dr. No, which are really more sort of just traditional sort of espionage thrillers. This is the first true James Bond movie, which is why it really works as a great sort of starting point. Although that's a lot harder to say now because it's over 50 years old and it definitely feels it.
Yes, for sure. I was actually lucky enough to see this in theaters recently.
Wow.
Which was really cool. So I got to see it at the Princeton Garden Theater, which is a great independent cinema close to where I live. And they do a lot of rep stuff. And they did a double feature night with Goldfinger and GoldenEye.
Oh my God, that's my dream.
It was so good. It was a Battle of the Bonds night, and you got a little pin. I had it somewhere. You got a little pin for the Bond that you preferred and all of that. It was great.
That's awesome. I will say I've never actually seen any of these older films in theaters, but the best theatrical Bond experience I've had was when I saw Casino Royale with the live orchestra in Toronto. And that is the best way to watch a James Bond movie. Oh my God, it was so good.
Amazing.
So good. If you ever, and it's a tour, so if it ever comes to your town and you like James Bond, obviously it's a more expensive ticket than going to the regular theater. I think the tour that goes around right now is either Casino Royale or Skyfall. I would pick Casino Royale because I think the score is better than Skyfall's score. But either way, you're in for a incredible night at the theater. Cannot recommend that highly enough. But okay, Nate, talk us through the background. We sort of alluded to it. This is the third Bond film, but how did we get here?
Yeah, so, and please jump in, because you know this series way better than I do, but I can at least contribute a little bit of research here. So, as we said, this is the third in the series, and importantly, like, Eon Productions needs to be shouted out as the longtime steward at this point in time of the franchise and getting it off the ground. You know, they bought the book rights for most of the Bond books. There's a whole other, kettle of fish with that. But they were the longtime stewards of this series. So you have Albert Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman were the sort of key people in the early years. And then that transitioned to Barbara Broccoli and... Go ahead.
So the way it works is, so the Broccolis basically were the stewards for the last 60 years. Saltzman, I think, either quits or gets bought out, I can't remember, around the Roger Moore era. The impression we got is that basically Cubby would produce one and then Saltzman would produce one, and that's how they were able to churn them out so quickly, was because they were sort of splitting duties. But Saltzman tended to spend crazy amounts of money and do wacky things, and eventually Broccoli just sort of said you can't do this anymore, and they got
so he's like the Moonraker.
Yeah, a little bit.
Guy.
And then I believe it's Broccoli's nephew, Michael G. Wilson, becomes one of the major producers in the 80s. And then Cubby retires or dies. I can't remember exactly what the relationship. I think the last one he does is Golden Eye, I want to say. Okay. And his daughter, Barbara, comes on board. And then it's Barbara and Michael have been stewarding it for the last 25 years or whatever it is. Until recently...
we gotta address the elephant in the room.
Yeah, we addressed this somewhat in our Oscar special, but obviously in the last month when this is airing, it was announced that the Broccolis have officially 100% sold the series off to Amazon. And as a longtime Bond fan, I think I speak for many Bond fans in saying this will likely be the end of the series. Or at least I don't think the series will ever be the same. There is an argument to be made that in the Craig era, they already were sort of going off the rails a little bit in trying to do the Marvelization, the sort of Bond cinematic universe. But it's very clear that Amazon very much wants to do that moving forward. There was a recent report that they wanted to do a Miss Moneypenny spinoff. Ugh. And Bezos...
Didn't Alfred from Batman kind of have a series exactly like that?
Yeah, I mean... Well, so...
we get to find out that Moneypenny's actually a badass and has some kind of complicated history.
This is where it gets all complicated, and part of the reason why, as much as I think the Craig movies are very, very good, there's also things about it that I absolutely hate. And obviously, in the Craig universe, which... I am of the opinion that the Craig universe exists on its own and is not part of the larger James Bond timeline, but there are differing theories there. Moneypenny, who becomes a secretary, we see in the beginning of Skyfall, is a field agent.
Right.
Whereas in the original series, she is very clearly just working in the office. You can't spin off that character, but you could have a spin-off of Miss Moneypenny as field agent, which I believe there was actually a comic book series that did that was very successful and actually quite good. But, the first instance of this, the movie that almost killed the franchise, Die Another Day, featured the American agent Jinx, played by Halle Berry. Right. And they were going to do a spin-off with her and Michael Madsen as the sort of CIA operative, as would be her M. But then the film was a colossal flop. And I think Catwoman also came out, and she basically killed that. So they were like, nope, we're not doing it. And then they had to reboot everything. But anyway, all this to say is that it came out that they wanted to do this Moneypenny spinoff. Barbara Broccoli was like, these guys are fucking idiots. No. And allegedly Bezos was just like, okay, pay this bitch. Those are his words. Pay this bitch whatever it takes to get rid of her. Jesus. And so that seems to be what happened, was that... the creatives of Amazon were very much conflicting with the Broccolis, who have been incredible stewards of this series for the last 60 years. They just were butting heads, and I guess it got to the point where they're like, we obviously can't work together. We're getting older. Let's just take a giant payday. And I guess kudos to them.
I can't blame them, honestly, because it sounds like a hard situation. And again, they've been at this for a really, really long time. Yeah. So, I get it. But it
just makes me all the more upset that Apple didn't buy the Bond rights. Because when MGM was going to be sold, there were rumors that Apple might buy it. Because this was when they were first getting into the, streaming business. It would be like, that's a pretty good get if you get, the longest running franchise in cinema history. Yep. And I feel like they would have been better stewards than Amazon. But, hey, who knows? Amazon at least puts their movies in theaters. They're not afraid of physical media necessarily in the same way that like other companies are. I could be pleasantly surprised. And
what if they give it to your man, Christopher Nolan? I mean, that's been floating around.
Yeah,
I don't know if that'll ever happen.
Who knows? Already they had that ridiculous reality series that nobody watched because nobody wanted it.
I don't even know what you're talking about.
I think it's called The Road to Bond, and it is an Amazon reality series hosted by Brian Cox. And again, the fact that you don't know it exists tells you everything you need to know.
It's a classic streaming problem.
But nobody wants that. This is the thing. The series has been around for 60 years. And granted, it has to evolve, and I get that. And I just don't think it's been evolving in the right way for the last 10 years as it was. And now I think it's ultimately doomed. And I think we will continue to get James Bond movies. But if the Eon production pipeline is not in place, I don't know that it will ever feel the same way. I think we'll start to feel like Never Say Never Again, the famous James Bond movie that is not an official James Bond movie.
Right. Yeah, I think the thing for me is that, like, when you look at, like, the long history of Eon Productions, there are a lot of bad Bond movies in that series. Yes. And there are also a lot of really good ones. Yes. And I think the thing that strikes me about this is that the same will probably be true of this, right? Of this new owner. However, I think the problem we're having now because of the consolidation is that everything feels similarly good and similarly bad, right? Yeah. Where it's like when it's bad, it's always bad in the same way. Yeah. And that gets really boring. And like one of the things that's exciting about having like a company like Eon really own a franchise and have so much control over it is that like when they make mistakes, they're mistakes you don't see anyone else making.
Yeah, exactly.
And like that's interesting. And it makes movie going exciting. And what I don't want is I don't want to see the mistakes they make be the same like movie slop over IP, version of Bond that you see in every piece of IP.
Well, you don't want the Miss Moneypenny spin-off TV series because you don't. That's not who can. Like I've sort of long stated for a while that I think what would be interesting for the Bond franchise to do is to go back to its roots and start setting the films back in period.
That would be very cool
because the biggest issue you have now with James Bond is like gadgets no longer exist. We don't have gadgets anymore because our phone can do everything.
Yep.
And so a lot of the elements that made Bond films exciting, even when we were kids in the 90s, was that you would get to see him have things that you could not have yourself. And you could never have yourself. I mean, famously, we're going to talk about it in Goldfinger. He has GPS in his car. Yeah. In the 1960s, that was unfathomable. Now we all have GPS in our car.
Yeah.
So I think in some respects, you need to go back in time in order to make a Bond film feel the way they used to. And that's why I recommended before The Man from U.N.C.L.E., the Guy Ritchie movie, because that's kind of what it does. It's a 60s espionage thriller that was made in the modern day.
Which I did catch up with, and it is very good. I really enjoyed it. It's really fun.
Yeah. But at the same time, and I've had this argument with other Bond fans, they're like, no, the whole thing is that James Bond always moves forward. The whole point of the franchise is that it's a period piece in the sense that it's a period piece of the time it was made. And that's what makes them interesting is that each decade gets the Bond for its decade and the film constantly has to evolve. That's my worry is that with Eon, I trust whatever they're going to do. With Amazon, I don't know that I do. That being said, maybe they will go in a different direction, kind of like DC does with like DC Black Label, and they'll be like, okay, these are the films that are part of the main timeline, and these are the films that are spin-offs that can be kind of interesting and do interesting things with interesting directors.
I think that that's actually highly likely, is that what they're going to do is fracture the series in a bunch of different ways, and some of them will probably be cool, and some of them will probably be crap, and... Anyway,
what I don't want is like the Lord of the, they have their Lord of the Rings series, the prequel series that nobody asked for. Amazon's not afraid to spend money, which is good.
It looks great, and I've watched some of it.
I think James Bond, that is my main worry, is like you cannot make these movies on a budget. They have to be made for obscene amounts of money to work.
And with very little, like with CGI that's really complementing, not overtaking the like locations, the practical effects, like the actual cars, all of that stuff, like in those movies, to their credit, is usually pretty real. And like the movies that have gone more in the CGI direction are some of the most hated in the series.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's interesting. Warner Brothers is now sort of rebooting Harry Potter. They're going to remake all of the books as television miniseries, which I said years ago is what they'll probably end up doing. Maybe that's what they do, is like the new films that Amazon makes will continue to move forward in time.
Yep.
And they'll remake the novels, which are in pretty much every instance actually very different from the plots of the films. So you'll get Goldfinger, the TV series, and it will be set in the 60s and it will more closely follow the book. I don't know what they're going to do. It's the Marvelization of everything, right? Like all of these companies are trying to follow in Marvel's footsteps, but now Marvel is reaching what I would call maybe like late 70s, early 80s James Bond era with the MCU of they're no longer setting the trends, they're following the trends, and they kind of have lost their way and they don't really know what to do. And that's the thing. It is interesting when you look at this franchise as a whole. A lot of these other long-standing franchises are going through the same growing pains that Bond went through in the 80s and 90s. And the Bond series very wisely always understands eventually there needs to be a hard reset.
Yes.
And usually
which is the same thing that happens in comics, incidentally.
Exactly.
You go off in too many directions, and then you need to like reset the continuity, reduce the number of characters, reduce the number of threads so that more people can come back in who don't look at it and be like, oh, I don't know, that's like a whole thing. It sounds daunting. Do I have to watch all of the previous movies? Like, you need to signal to people like, no, this is a fresh start. It's a great entry point.
So we're now at that point where, because of No Time to Die, all I will say is that they are now at a point where they have to do a hard reset. Craig's contract is over. They've got to recast Bond. A hard reset was going to happen regardless.
Yep.
But this will be the first time that hard reset is happening without Eon overseeing it. And it will be interesting to see where it goes. I do not think the Bond franchise will ever die unless it gets to the point where Amazon is like, this is no longer profitable and they sell it off. I think at this point, it's been 60 years, 25 films. You have a built-in fan base as long as you don't piss them off. Yeah. I'm going to keep going to see them because I'm a sucker. Sure. But I just worry what direction it's going to head in.
The concern is not that they'll die, it's that they'll become a zombie. Right.
The concern is that it will become Die Another Day over and over and over again. Like, that's what we don't want. You know, if they bring back Martin Campbell for the hard reset and we get another Casino
that would be
Royale or something.
A third time around?
Yeah, like that. Maybe. Who knows? It's worrisome, but, you know, prove me wrong, kids. Prove me wrong, as Skinner would say.
All right. Well, let's take it back to Goldfinger for a moment and talk about like what was going on in Eon and with the directors and writers and all that stuff around that time, because it is very different than it is now.
And this was, in some ways, was also a reset for the series because we get a new director for the first time.
Right, for sure. So this is a transition moment from Terrence Young, who did the first two movies, who kind of, like, that's what he's mostly known for. Yeah. You know, he also did Wait Until Dark, which is actually a really good movie with Audrey Hepburn.
That's a great movie.
Yep. And he also did some Charles Bronson movies, apparently. But other than that, like, this is what he's known for, is starting the Bond series. And this moves to Guy Hamilton, who apparently was a friend of Cubby Broccoli's for a long time, and was actually approached for Dr. No, but he couldn't do it for, like, family reasons. And apparently, this was in the commentary, the banned commentary, Broccoli and Saltzman actually thought that Hamilton didn't like the script for the original Bond movies, right? Like Dr. No. And they were like, it's okay, we can rewrite it, whatever. And he said, no, don't rewrite them. You have to keep in the cornball stuff.
Right.
And he thinks that's why they came back to him. Was because he kind of got the tone of the series, and in fact kind of leans more into that stuff in this movie than the previous two entries.
Interesting.
Of course, he goes on to direct 3 more movies, including another one with Connery, Diamonds Are Forever, and also overseeing the transition to Roger Moore with Live and Let Die and The Man with the Golden Gun. So he's one of the people who, like, you know, resets it here and then kind of resets it again.
Yeah.
Much like our friend
Martin Campbell.
Martin Campbell, exactly, with Brosnan and then with Craig. So yeah, I mean, I wanted to ask you, Adam, like, do you feel like you notice a difference between Young and Hamilton, or is it really more of like, you know, Eon is kind of like the director in a sense, and they're kind of like guiding the tone and all that kind of stuff? Or a third option, is it really more just like a gradual evolution rather than like a full reset in this movie?
This is a very different film from the previous two. I mean, Dr. No is obviously just on a much smaller scale. That's part of it. Like, that movie was made for so little. This is the sort of reset point, and as we said, it's really when Bond becomes Bond. How much of that is because of Hamilton, and how much of that is just because of Eon, it's tough to say because it is so early. What becomes interesting is looking at Hamilton's other entries in the series. So he's brought back for Diamonds Are Forever, which I think it's one of the worst Bond movies. It's so incredibly boring, but it's famous because it's when Sean Connery comes back. Connery had quit. They brought in George Lazenby for On Her Majesty's for On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which is a very different Bond movie from everything else. And then they need to reset things because Connery comes back, and they sort of bring him back, and they do this sort of wacky. It's awful.
That's the one in Vegas?
Yeah, it's so bad. I hate it. But again, coming back to the U.S. like they did in Goldfinger.
Right.
And then you get Live and Let Die, which I actually really like. It's probably in my top 5, but it is also a very different movie because it is essentially a blaxploitation movie.
Right.
Once again, coming back to the U.S. But I think it works much better. And then The Man with the Golden Gun, which I loved as a kid, but now is also very much a slog. So, like, he's sort of very hit or miss as a director. But as you said, like, at that point, do the directors even matter? Is this really just in the hands of the producers? And I think, yes. I think by that point, when he comes back with Roger Moore, you know, yes, they're bringing him in as a steady hand who's sort of handled these transitions before, but it's all in Eon's control. Much like the alleged stuff with Marvel, right? Like, it gets to a point where it's... The director is really just kind of a figurehead, but, like, it's the producers that are running this ship. So he's a very different director from Terrence Young. You know, Terrence Young is sort of famous in that he kind of taught Connery how to be Bond. He took him to his tailor. He was kind of molding Bond in his image in a little bit of a way. So, and I guess if you look at the other stuff that Hamilton made outside of Bond, he did The Mirror Cracked and Evil Under the Sun. So The Mirror Cracked is an Agatha Christie movie. It's a Miss Marple, and Angela Lansbury plays Miss Marple. And then Evil Under the Sun, it's like a Poirot movie.
Yeah.
That wasn't done by Sidney Lumet, so it's not as good. But yeah, anyway, so I've seen a couple other of his films, and like he's a decent director, but you know, he's not an auteur. But I also don't think that James Bond movies should be made by auteurs. It's why I don't think the Sam Mendes movies are maybe as good as everybody else thinks they are. But,
interesting.
It's also why, as much as I love Chris Nolan, I don't necessarily think that he would be the right choice to direct that movie.
So interesting to hear you say that.
He made his own James Bond movie. It's called Tenet. If you want to see what a Chris Nolan James Bond movie would look like, go watch Tenet.
Yeah, Inception is also pretty James Bond adjacent.
Yeah. Spielberg wanted to make a James Bond movie. They refused to let him. He made Indiana Jones. There's a reason that they don't get big name directors because they are in charge, not the director.
But see, I think that's the thing is that like it is because the producers were sort of quasi directors in certain ways. They had a lot of creative control. Let's say that. Amazon might go the other direction of being like, actually, we don't want to have any creative control in the way to
we need an actual creative in charge.
Is to have someone, or they get a Kevin Feige, right?
Yeah,
where it's like they actually hire a sort of producer, not a lone gunman, a gun for hire. There you go. They like select a gun for hire that can actually steward the series, and that could be interesting actually to have someone like that providing that creative control and consistency. That may be, honestly, that might be the best case scenario for the current state of Bond, in my opinion.
I feel like when other franchises, like Dave Filoni and Star Wars, and like, I don't know. Hi, everybody. It's Adam from the future here. Just jumping in to say that when we recorded this episode, the whole Amazon situation wasn't fully settled, but obviously now we know that it is a little bit more so. MGM announced that producers Amy Pascal and David Heyman have been selected to produce the next James Bond film. I don't know if that means they're going to oversee the whole franchise as a whole, like the Broccoli's did moving forward, but obviously David Heyman was one of the main producers on the Harry Potter series, so he certainly has franchise experience. Amy Pascal used to run Sony Pictures, so she also actually has James Bond producing experience. Guess we'll wait and see how it turns out. Cautiously optimistic, maybe, sort of. We'll see. Anyways, back to the episode as recorded. The way I see it is that James Bond should not be in a cinematic universe. The whole point is that
I agree. The
timeline is kind of foggy, and like, yes, films make reference to earlier films and stuff like that, but the whole point is that they exist on their own, and that's the best way to do this.
I really hope they keep that element and let it be fractured and let it be confusing and not on one timeline. And I know the Daniel Craig ones kind of did that, but they also did a good job of, for the most part, each one is self-contained enough that like you don't have to have seen all of the other stuff to come into it. It's very much like its own story. So I hope they keep that part of it alive. But anyway.
Speaking of story, let's talk about screenwriter Richard Maibaum.
Yeah. So Maibaum is like another one of the threads of continuity, really, in the series, right? So he wrote all but 3 of the Eon Productions Bond movies from the beginning of the series until his death in 1991.
Yeah.
So
Crazy.
Pretty amazing. Actually, coincidentally, the very first one that he did not write was You Only Live Twice, which
written by
Roald Dahl, who we talked about it in that episode. You could go listen to it, but
it's such a bizarre choice.
It's a weird choice. One thing I don't know if I realized when we recorded that, though, is that Ian Fleming also wrote Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, which Roald Dahl wrote the script for with the movie. So I wonder if that's kind of the connection point.
I don't know. But...
Really fucking weird. Anyway, so Maibaum was expert at recognizing how to adapt Ian Fleming stories. Like,
yes.
I think this is maybe the issue to going back to the source material as like a way to reboot the series, is that many of them were adapted in a way that was like, yeah, this isn't going to work on screen. Like, we need to actually make some changes here.
Well, very quickly it became, we're just going to take the title of the book and maybe the loosest of the overview of the plot, but everything else we're throwing out. Like,
right. And this is like the middle ground, really.
This is a middle ground, yeah. This is taking the sort of basic beats of the plot, but then appropriately changing them to improve them, I would argue.
Right, exactly. So, like, just a few examples of what Maibaum did with this script. He moved the gold-painted girl from the latter part of the story to the beginning as, like, one of the sort of introductions to the Goldfinger character. Great idea, right?
Brilliant.
He replaced the buzzsaw in the famous industrial laser scene. Originally, we talked about it again in our previous episode, but was originally a buzzsaw, which he decided was a little bit too like silent movie mustache twirling villain thing.
Totally.
And instead was like, no, we're going to use the latest technology that no one knows about, which is industrial lasers. Great idea. You sort of alluded to this, but the whole plot around Fort Knox doesn't actually make any sense in the book because it was meant to be a robbery of Fort Knox, which on one hand is like, okay, well, that's like
steal the gold.
Yeah, it's a much simpler plot of like, he's going to break into Fort Knox and steal the gold. Fine. The problem is that, as it turns out, stealing gold bars is very difficult because they're very heavy.
Yes.
And it would take like over a full day to like actually move all the shit. And so instead, they come up with this like ludicrous plot for the movie that involves like irradiating the gold so it's unusable, and then eventually he'll like get it back or something.
Well, no, this is where it does get a little convoluted, but the core premise kind of makes sense. Goldfinger's plan is to irradiate the gold, therefore making the gold at Fort Knox worthless. Although, like, if it's just sitting in Fort Knox and nobody's moving it anyway, it's not really that worthless. But that's where it gets a little bit like, okay, it doesn't entirely work.
It does take like hundreds of years, I think, for like radiation to wear off.
I think that someone did the math, and it's basically like it's 60 years or something like that. So basically, now the gold would be tradable again.
Right.
But again, like, it just sits there; it doesn't do anything. But so irradiate the gold, and therefore the U.S. would have to rely on Goldfinger's stash of gold because he has a massive stash of his own gold. And that's sort of the plot, is like, I'll ruin their gold. They'll have to rely on my gold and buy it from me, and then I'll become rich. Richer. But yeah, I mean, it is ludicrous. Although, that being said, the current president of the United States seems to think that maybe the gold isn't in Fort Knox, and it's, becomes more and more like a Bond movie every single day with that administration. But that's a topic for another day.
Indeed. Oh yeah, the other thing with Richard Maibaum that's worth mentioning is that he also worked with Alfred Hitchcock. You definitely can see some Hitchcockian fingerprints on this movie. And particularly on the commentary, they reference Hitchcock's idea that you should have at least 3 quote-unquote bumps in any given movie, which he used to describe thrilling moments. Right. Moments where, like, the audience is like, whoa!
Yeah, totally.
And so this movie definitely follows that. It probably has more than 3. It's almost a kind of Indiana Jones type philosophy of, like, just the good bits. So anyway, apparently, Hitchcock did not like this movie, really.
I mean, I'm not entirely surprised, but...
Right. We talked about it a little bit in the Jaws episode, which I think he kind of has a track record of, like, all the people who admire him, he's just kind of like, I don't know, they're fine. But he did enjoy one particular moment in this movie. And I'm going to ask you, Adam, can you guess what moment it was?
I'm going to guess it was one of the problematic elements or the naked lady elements.
Nope.
Oh, okay.
Nope.
Okay, good. Well,
it's a moment, I will say it's a moment of particular Hitchcockian humor that he loved.
Oh, is it when James Bond is trapped and he's like waving to the guard?
Nope.
Oh, okay. Because that's one of my favorite moments. I don't know. What would it be?
It's the little old lady with the machine gun.
Yes, of course I did. Yes, I remember reading that. And that's very Hitchcockian.
It totally is. This character, like, who comes out, she's very timid and sweeping and stuff, and then later comes out with the machine gun and attacks Bond. It is a perfect Hitchcock moment.
That does feel like something that would be right up his... I could hear him chuckling away in the theater to that.
Yes. So yeah, I mean, that's the gist with Richard Maibaum. He's a critical part of the DNA of the series and contributed some of the most important changes to the script for this movie to like really make it what it is. Like, it just wouldn't be the same movie if it weren't for his work.
I want to give him full credit. He has done a great job of adapting the book. I actually got the book. I've never read it before. I haven't finished reading it. It's an easy read. I've mentioned many times, I have a toddler. I don't have as much time to do stuff. But I got about halfway through, and there was one scene in particular that I understand why it was cut, but I think it could have made an interesting set piece. So after the golf game, which, let me tell you, if you think watching a golf game is boring, try reading about it for 2.5 chapters. But after the golf game, Goldfinger invites Bond back to his house because the whole thing is that, like, Bond is trying to get close to Goldfinger by working for Universal Export, which is his cover, and trying to get hired by Goldfinger and all this stuff. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Goldfinger invites him back to his house, and then something happens that Goldfinger has to leave very quickly, and Bond is left to his own devices. And very quickly, Bond realizes that Goldfinger has actually wired up the entire house with cameras and is filming him. And so Bond then finds the cameras and takes a cat who's roaming around and throws him into the bins with the film, thus overexposing and destroying the film. And then Goldfinger, of course, discovers this, is pretty sure that it's Bond, but isn't entirely sure, so then he gives the cat to Oddjob to eat. Because, yes.
That's a little racist.
Yeah, well, this is the thing. If there's the other biggest change from the book is the horrible racism towards Koreans that is in the book. I mean, the Korean henchmen are a part of the movie, but not in a racist way. Ian Fleming was not a good person.
No.
And was a horrible racist, misogynist, homophobe. But, hey, he wrote a thrilling book.
And that's why we need Maibaum.
Yes, exactly.
To launder his racism into something that is slightly less racist.
Yes. This movie, it's got some misogyny issues, but far less racial issues than You Only Live Twice. But anyway.
Well, yeah, low bar. Okay, so I think we obviously need to talk a little bit about promotion and then how this was received, right?
Right.
So it was a very groundbreaking movie in terms of promotion, which makes sense. It's part of what helps it blow up to be the sensation that it is. There were a lot of like tie-ins in a very modern kind of way. This is sort of before, like, you have all sorts of action figures and things like that come into it. We talked about it, again, way back with Planet of the Apes. That's sort of one of the movies that like helps to push that forward. But this also had some tie-ins around like the Aston Martin, of course, right? This is the first appearance of the Aston Martin.
The DB5, certainly, yeah.
Yeah. And so in New York, they actually like had the Aston Martin on display in a local showroom as a tie-in to the movie, right? They aired a behind-the-scenes TV special called The Incredible James Bond, which featured clips from the first 3 movies as well as like behind the scenes footage leading up to this movie. So, again, feels very contemporary, like hard to imagine that happening in 1964.
Man, I remember when Star Wars Episode 1 was coming out, and there were so many of those airing in like prime time.
Totally.
Like, we're going to show you an hour-long behind-the-scenes look at this new Star Wars movie because we're all really excited because it's definitely going to be really good.
Yep. But like, as a kid, like at that age.
Yeah, I was losing my mind. I was so excited.
Like, those behind the scenes specials were like a really important part of becoming like a movie lover.
Yeah,
and
totally.
A cinephile was just like seeing how it all comes together and hearing from the directors and all of that. The only hiccup, of course, with promotion was one particular character who has a name that was somewhat hard to promote in America, which was Pussy Galore, who apparently in the American media, they only could call her by either her first name or her last name.
Right.
So they would refer to her as Pussy or as Galore, but never as Pussy Galore. Which I guess was like, they figured that people wouldn't quite piece it together. It's funny to think that, like, they were fine with calling her Pussy.
Yes.
Right? Which by modern standards would be like that's the word we have to avoid. But they did actually call her that. It's just when you put it together that they thought it was particularly lewd. My guess is that they were afraid that people would pick up on the fact that she is supposed to be a lesbian in the movie and in the book. And that was the thing that American media actually was worried about. It's not like, female anatomy, but the sort of gay subtext.
It's a funny flip from, I don't know if you remember when The Spy Who Shagged Me came out. In North America, that title was totally fine. But in the UK, that's the equivalent of calling the movie The Spy Who F***ed Me, right? Like, shag is sort of...
Right.
That movie uses shag so liberally, but like in the UK, or at least at the time, it was a bit more lewd. So they promote the hell out of it. Did it work? How was the reception? Did this movie do well?
Yeah, so here's a little microcosm. So the movie was so popular at its initial screening in New York that the DeMille Theater started staying open 24 hours a day.
Holy shit.
For screenings from the premiere on December 20th through the end of the year. So for 10 days, it's just running 24/7, basically.
Damn.
The movie makes $59 million off of a total budget of $3 million. So that's
not a bad return on investment, especially... 59 million in 1960s money is way more than we're thinking of. So that's incredible. Yeah,
absolutely. It gets one Academy Award nomination for sound effects.
Okay, fair enough.
Which, sure. I mean, again, like at this time, even that is kind of a big deal. Like, it's not like I'd expect this movie to get anything necessarily in 1964. So interesting. Obviously, this is like a big player on the AFI lists.
Yeah.
This is like such a perfect AFI movie that kind really of like... is. Mix of popularity, but also craft and staying power and all that kind of stuff. So it is number 71 on 100 Years, 100 Thrills. Auric Goldfinger is 49 on AFI's 100 Years, 100 Heroes and Villains. A Martini, Shaken Not Stirred, is number 90 on AFI's 100 Years, 100 Quotes. And Shirley Bassey's title theme is number 53 on AFI's 100 Years, 100 Songs. So it's got some staying power. The other interesting thing for the sake of our podcast is that the parodies started immediately. And of course, drafting off of the first two movies, because they were already pretty big hits. But this movie really kind of like put it into overdrive. So the National Lampoon released a book called Alligator, which is like a very, very thinly veiled parody of James Bond, to the point where I think they literally just like put asterisks over like a letter in the names. To make it like legally allowed to be published. Get Smart, the TV series, was very much like riffing off of, Bond, but also the sort of spy craze and sort of taking it into this comedic zone. In the UK, you get a series of movies starring Michael Caine called The Ipcris File. It was the first in the series.
Yes, I think I've seen that. It's, if memory serves. And I remember liking it.
Yeah. It's sort of like just a different take on Bond, but there's a bit of a more of a comedic and cheeky element to it because it's Michael Caine. And then Wild Wild West, which of course we spoke about earlier this season at the beginning of the year. It premiered in 1965, a year after this film, along with The Man from U.N.C.L.E. Both of those, of course, like drafting off of the James Bond craze in general, with again, like maybe a somewhat more comedic tone, but also just like straight spy stuff. So it's like the parodies and the imitators are in full force.
We also have to address In Like Flint, which Austin Powers refers to as, it's my favorite movie, which Wikipedia refers to as a 1967 American spy-fi comedy film. I think the reason why Austin Powers nods to it is that it is sort of doing Austin Powers before Austin Powers. It's meant to be a comedic version of James Bond, as opposed to we're going to just do like a spy movie because that's obviously the craze right now.
Right.
So I've never seen it, but I feel like it is relatively highly regarded. And Mike Myers obviously says like, yes, obviously Austin Powers is based on James Bond, but the main influence for us was actually more Casino Royale, the 1967 version, and the Flint movies than maybe actually Bond itself.
Right. Interesting. Okay, Adam, can you guess the top 10 movies of 1964 and where this fits in that list?
I mean, I'm going to assume it's top 3 just based on the box office.
Yeah. It's good thinking. I'll give you a hint, though, on the other top 3. We've covered both of them on the podcast.
Oh, okay.
1964.
1964. What else have we done in 1964? Can you?
So last year was 2024, so we did them as sort of an anniversary. Nod.
Okay. Yes, and I feel like I remember this coming up, and I just
one of them had a really great guest.
What's up, Doc?
No, but right guest.
Oh, okay. My Fair Lady.
My Fair Lady. That is number 2.
Okay, great. And then the other one, what else have we done from 1964?
There's a famous rivalry between My Fair Lady and
Mary Poppins.
Mary Poppins, exactly. So Mary Poppins is number 1.
Well, I mean,
yeah, and My Fair Lady is number 2.
Yeah, I mean, family movies, right? Fun for the whole family.
Yep. And you said Goldfinger's in the top 3.
That's my guess. So I think it would be number 3.
It's number 3. Absolutely. Okay. So any other guesses on the rest?
I have no clue. I'm going to assume like a war movie like Tora 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 or something, and probably a Western, but I honestly have no idea.
Okay. So number 4, we have The Carpetbaggers.
Yeah, like I've never heard of that, Nate. That movie doesn't exist.
A drama based on a book starring George Peppard and Alan Ladd.
Okay, great.
That classic.
Yeah.
Number 5 is another Bond movie.
Oh, well, then it would have to be From Russia with Love.
That's right.
Right, because this was back when they were literally like churning these bad boys out. So like it was like a year later that it came out. So that makes sense. Okay.
Yep. Okay, number 6 has a Simpsons reference to it. It's the episode where Homer gets accused of sexual harassment. And when during the TV broadcast where they're talking about this is the nickname that Homer is given by Kent Brockman.
Oh crap! I don't remember. What is it?
Father Goose.
Father Goose. Okay.
Yes, which is a wartime romantic comedy.
There you go. Yeah,
starring Cary Grant, Leslie Caron, and Trevor Howard. Okay, number 7 is some real Adam shit. You might have even recommended this movie this season.
Oh.
It's very 60s.
Okay.
It's comedic.
Okay. Give me a first letter.
Well, there's an article. A-S.
Okay. I don't know. I'm so
Shot
bad
in
at
the Dark.
A Shot in the Dark, yes!
You should have just taken A Shot in the Dark,
yes,
Adam.
I should have taken A Shot in the Dark. Yes, that movie, well, my memory of that movie is that it rules.
Right, and that is a sequel to another movie.
The Pink Panther.
That is also on this list.
Oh, okay, The Pink Panther.
The Pink Panther is at number 10.
A movie that I don't like as much.
Okay, interesting.
It's more of a slog.
Yeah, fair enough. And then there are 2 more on this list that you are never, ever going to get.
No, I mean, I've done terribly so far, so.
Basically don't exist, as far as I know. A movie called What a Way to Go! ! Which is a comedy starring Shirley MacLaine and her 4 husbands, Paul Newman, Robert Mitchum, Dean Martin, Gene Kelly, Bob Cummings, and Dick Van Dyke. That's more than 4.
What a cast.
Yeah, it's quite a cast. And The Unsinkable Molly Brown.
Okay, that I've heard of at least.
Yeah, that's because you're in the musical world.
And also the Titanic. Kathy Bates' character is playing the historical Molly Brown, who was known as the Unsinkable Molly Brown, and I guess they made a musical about her.
Yeah, Western-themed musical comedy starring Debbie Reynolds.
There you go.
So there you go.
Carrie Fisher's mom. Okay.
Quite a rogues gallery for our top 10 there. All right, Adam, shall we do it? Shall we dive into the depths of this movie?
Yeah, let's dive into the deep end and see how far we swim. Okay, it's got a great cold open, which starts to become a hallmark of the series. You have the gun barrel sequence, you have a cold open that is usually, if not always, unrelated to the main plot, but kind of just is a fun little action set piece.
Right.
Which now, Mission Impossible has started doing it. Arguably doing better than James Bond series.
Yeah.
And then we get the iconic opening titles and title theme song. let's talk about the titles first. Did you like them, Nate, or did you think they were dog shit? Because I don't like them. We'll talk about why, but...
it's funny. I think I like James Bond opening titles in principle more than I usually like them in practice.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
In general, I'm like, oh yeah, cool. Like a cool piece of animation or stylized filmmaking that's kicking off the movie, tying into a song. Like, it's a great idea. But then I don't think I have one that I'm like, that one's amazing. It looks pretty cool. I'm sure at the time this was like super cool stuff to see on screen.
What's interesting, of course, is that basically, so From Russia with Love and Goldfinger are the only two in the series up until the 90s when this guy dies that were designed by Robert Brownjohn instead of series regular Morris Binder. Oh. And Binder is the one who's sort of responsible for the dancing ladies and using lasers and colors and animation. Whereas these are just literally, let's take scenes from the movie and project them onto a gold-plated lady. And that's why I don't really like them. I just think they're kind of boring and uncreative. But I wanted to ask you, did you notice anything unusual about them?
I don't think so.
Okay, well, I'll reveal what it is. Some of the stuff that they're projecting is actually From Russia with Love and not Goldfinger.
Oh, sure. Yeah, so, that makes sense to me.
Which again is like, I kind of understand why, but it's like, what's the point of that? Like, why are you showing scenes from a different movie? So again, just one of the many reasons why I just don't like this approach as much as what they eventually get into.
They're still putting together the dream team, I think, is sort of the bottom line.
Yeah.
And, they're still kind of experimenting in these first few movies, trying to find the right people. And this doesn't benefit from the person that they stick with forever.
But the thing I do like about the opening titles is, of course, the iconic theme song, which I feel like...
so good.
Goldfinger.
I love Shirley Bassey, so.
Yeah, I mean, well, let's talk about it, Nate, because I know you love this song, and we sort of alluded to this in our Oscars episode.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great. What else do you say? It is a very memorable theme song, but more importantly, like, this is the first time that they kind of take the theme song and integrate it into the score. And so I think that the theme song for Goldfinger results in one of my favorite versions of the Bond score, with the like really brassy sort of sound to it, which incidentally is what the Simpsons parodies from this all the time. Anytime you hear a kind of Bond-like theme on the Simpsons, which is pretty often, especially in the later part of where we're looking at, like seasons maybe 9 through 13 or something in that zone, usually what you're hearing is a parody of this. There are many other Bond scores that you could pull from, but like the sort of brassiness of the instruments and stuff, that's from Goldfinger, in my opinion. But I am interested to hear your take on this, Adam, because in the Oscar episode, we talked about the terrible Bond tribute. I speculated that, of course, Goldfinger would be in the medley, and it was not. So I'm curious, Adam, first of all, like, what's your take on the Goldfinger theme? And secondly, do you feel like it's been eclipsed by other Bond themes since then?
I think in terms of popular culture, it has maybe been eclipsed. I mean, that's the thing that made Skyfall, which is what that medley ended with, makes it so unique, especially from today's standpoint, is that song became like a top 40 hit. It wasn't just a James Bond theme. They got Adele, who was one of the biggest artists at the time. And I mean, they have not been successful since. In fact, the last two Bond themes were absolute trash, in my opinion. But yeah, that song became this massive, massive hit. And I think as a result, it's maybe more in the modern public conscience than Goldfinger would be today. What I think is also interesting, too, is that Skyfall is actually... There are moments in the orchestration that pays homage and nods to Goldfinger. Which, I mean, I guess it's also... They both are taking elements from the actual James Bond theme, the sort of like... da-da-da-da. But that's what's sort of interesting, is that the way Skyfall kind of interpolates Goldfinger, which is interpolating the original theme. And that's what makes, I think, the Skyfall such a good Bond song. Yes, it's a great song in and of itself, but it's hearkening back to Bondy elements. And I think that's where the worst James Bond songs are, because they just try and be a pop hit and not really do anything Bondy.
Right. I have to say, I'm not a big fan of Live and Let Die. You know, not necessarily as a song, but just like it's just not the right tone.
No, it's a great song. It's a terrible Bond theme. And I think the thing that you also alluded to that I have missed in more recent Bond films, and I think it was because they stopped using David Arnold to do the scores, was that he was the kind of composer, much like John Barry, they tended to work with the songwriters so that they could interpolate the song throughout the score.
Right.
And I think Casino Royale does this really, really well, because the whole point of Casino Royale, I actually wrote an essay on this in university, was that you don't get the Bond theme proper until the very end of the film when he becomes, quote unquote, becomes James Bond. So you can't then have all those sort of Bond themes throughout the film, but what Arnold does is he interpolates the You Know My Name theme song throughout the film in a really beautiful way. And then, so that's what I mean, is that when you have them sort of working in concert, you can get this score that is working really well because it's reflecting it. And I think that was the whole thing with Skyfall, was like, I think it was delivered pretty late in the game. So the score doesn't really allude to it very much, if at all. And it's just like one of those things that makes a Bond film feel more like a Bond film, is when they're able to do that.
Yeah, well, and being able to keep it feeling fresh. Like, that's the other thing, is it's just like, so you're not just repeating the Bond theme over and over again, but you're getting little riffs from this other song. You're getting like a little bit of flavor from the instrumentation of the song.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's an important ingredient in what makes it last so long.
What's also interesting is that Saltzman apparently hated the song. In my giant James Bond book, I was just sort of like flipping through and reading stuff. And yeah, he was like, well, hopefully it does well, or I guess it's fine. Like, I don't like it, but we'll just run with it. And then, of course, it becomes like the most iconic theme for basically 25, 30 years of the franchise. But
and Shirley Bassey being, or Bassey, I don't know how you say her name.
I think it's Bassey, but and she comes back 2 more times to sing multiple other themes. So.
Right, and it's like, even though they didn't include Goldfinger in the tribute, which I still think is a travesty, they did include Diamonds Are Forever, which is another Shirley Bassey song. So, at least she got that nod, but like, I feel like she is so associated with the series.
Absolutely.
As like the person who does the great theme songs. So, yeah. Let's talk about the cast, because like, again, this is another important ingredient that of course evolves over time with Bond.
Yeah.
But we have Sean Connery in probably his like most iconic version of the role, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say it's also probably the last time he actually wants to be there.
Well, that makes sense, because he was basically like, I'm not sure if I want to do this. I don't want to be typecast as James Bond for the rest of my career. So you better pay me $1 million, which again, at the time is significant, right? Because I think we said how is this possible? The budget for the movie was $3 million, and James Bond and Sean Connery asked for $1 million. So. Yeah. I guess that'll keep you satisfied in the role temporarily, but where does Connery rank for you as a Bond, and how do you feel like his performance sort of evolves film to film, if at all?
Well, I mean, I would say the way it evolves is that he stops caring and starts phoning it in and from basically after this point. Look, if you're a James Bond fan, I think you have to say that Connery's the best Bond because he's the first Bond. I don't necessarily agree. I'm not saying he's bad. He's great. He is great, and he sort of sets the template. And he's the right Bond for these movies. Roger Moore obviously takes it in a different direction and a little more into a winking sort of like comedic mode. And then I think the struggle that the remaining Bonds have is like, well, who do I play to? Do I go more the Roger Moore route? Do I go more the Sean Connery route? Do I try and do my own thing? And I think we don't really get another actor who's confident enough to do their own thing until we get to Craig. And I think he's given that leeway because he gets to reboot the series from scratch, essentially. So he's very consciously not trying to do what the other people are doing, and there's no expectation for him to do what the other people are doing because he's playing Bond before he's quote-unquote Bond. So I think Connery's very, very good in this. And you see the sort of charm that he has. And it's so funny when you watch all of these like behind the scenes documentaries, everybody's talking about how he's so sexy and so good looking and so strong and masculine. And it just shows how times have maybe changed, because it's a very different form of masculinity than maybe we champion today.
Yeah.
But he's definitely not my favorite Bond, but I know that he's a very important element, and without him, you don't get Bond. So...
Right, for sure. And again, like as you said, he sort of establishes the spectrum of like where your performance can be until Craig, who kind of blows it up. Although he is like closer to Connery, let's say.
100%.
in terms of like his gruffness and seriousness, but then is able to bring some of the comedy that Sean Connery does bring some comedy to this role as well, even though he's more on the serious end of the spectrum.
Yeah, this is the first Bond film where you start to get the like puns and double entendres, and then they just sort of double down on that with more. And Connery is able to handle that well, but it's because he's not being required to go so over the top like they do with some of the other guys. So
totally. Well, what about the villains? Again, Goldfinger, probably the most, so maybe not the most iconic villain, but he's up there, maybe one of the best villains. You have Oddjob, his loyal henchman, and Pussy Galore. So what do we think of this rogues gallery, I guess, for this movie? I mean, I think it's pretty great.
I think
I think it's pretty good.
No, I think Goldfinger is arguably the best villain, certainly the most memorable. Like if you were to say name a James Bond villain and their henchmen, I think everybody would be able to say Goldfinger and Oddjob.
Sure.
I think you might be able to say Blofeld, but like Blofeld has a ton of different henchmen. Like he doesn't have his guy. The only other ones that come to mind immediately is Christopher Walken as Max Zorin and Grace Jones as Mayday. Like.
I don't even remember that.
So that's from A View to a Kill, one of the weaker entries in the 80s. But they sort of follow this idea of like, we'll have the main villain and they'll have their henchmen, but they don't necessarily always work super well. I guess the only other one that comes to mind is the man with the golden gun, and then he has his henchman who really isn't much of a henchman, but Knick Knack, played by Hervé Villechaize, like the small guy.
Yeah.
But that's what I mean. It's like, it gets to the point where it starts to become like a joke. Whereas like Oddjob is actually kind of a threatening henchman. They have this whole thing of he doesn't really speak English, so he's a nonverbal character.
Well, I think he actually can't speak. I don't think it's that he can't speak English. I think he literally is mute in the movie.
Yeah, and I might be getting mixed up with like the lore that's in the book. But yeah, like he basically says like, I think that's like his only dialogue in the movie. But he's this like very brooding force of nature. I mean, the irony being that in GoldenEye for N64, when I played with my friends, we all banned Oddjob from being one of the characters you play as, because for whatever reason in the game, they make him like a little person. And so he's shorter than all the other characters. So he becomes very difficult to hit. And then they make Jaws like much taller than everyone. So he's harder to get like headshots on. But again, he's sort of the iconic henchman, to the point where like in Austin Powers, random tasks is the parody of Oddjob, right? Like the villain is Blofeld, but the henchman is Oddjob. So
yeah, totally. It is interesting like how both of these characters, right, Goldfinger and Oddjob, how they get cast is kind of strange. So Gert Frobe plays Goldfinger, and he's like a German actor that was discovered off of a movie called It Happened in Broad Daylight, where he plays a child molester. Cool. So, yeah, pretty wild. There was a whole controversy with him because he actually served in the German army during World War II.
Right, but wasn't an actual member of the Nazi party or whatever?
Yeah, so he was during the occupation of Vienna, but it actually came out during the International Court after World War II that he actually had saved a Jewish woman's life and hid her in his apartment. And so they were sort of like, oh, actually, you were doing what you could, even though you were part of the army. But for a while, it was like this movie was banned in Israel because of Frobe. And then that came out and it was sort of like cleared. But very interesting guy. And again, just the idea that like they were casting off of like German film is pretty interesting. And then kind of similarly, Oddjob, Harold Sakata. So he's an Olympic weightlifter from the United States. He was born in Hawaii. And basically, Guy Hamilton discovered him watching pro wrestling on TV and was like, that guy. That's the guy. He just has the look, right?
And he does. He really does have the look.
Totally. Thought that was pretty cool. And then let's talk about Honor Blackman as Pussy Galore.
She's a very unique Bond. I don't like to use this term anymore, but Bond girl.
Yeah. She's older than Connery.
Yeah.
And she's an actual actress, I mean, no offense, but most of them are typically like models, right? I mean,
yeah, they're usually Swedish women that are overdubbed by English actors because their English is so poor.
Right. So Honor Blackman is like an actress who was actually like known at the time that the movie came out, which was quite unusual and continued to be quite unusual for a long time in the series. She's probably best known for a role in The Avengers, the TV series, as Kathy Gale, which even then she had an interesting relationship with that. She asked the role to be rewritten as though it were a male character. very intelligently navigated at the time. And it is surprising. I didn't really realize that the Avengers sort of predated Bond. So it's contributing to the whole spy craze even before the first Bond movie, at least. Not the books, obviously.
Yeah, I think it predates the films, but was obviously probably coasting off of the success of the books, because the books were like really, really successful. But then as the Bond films became more and more part of the culture, that show evolved to be more and more Bond-like and have more gadgets and stuff like that.
Right. Makes sense. Yeah, and I love her introduction in this movie, right? The very first shot you get of her is like Bond has been knocked out or something, and he's waking up and he sees her face, and you just get this like long close-up of her face, kind of looking directly at the camera, more or less. And she has this smile that's a little crooked and like kind of creeping up on her face, and she's kind of just like looking at you. It's such a great, memorable introduction for her. She's really giving me Catwoman vibes from like, you know, the Adam West TV series.
Absolutely.
Which, as you know, of course, I'm very into. I think it's such a great vibe. But yeah, I mean, Adam, what do you think about Pussy Galore?
I mean, I 100% agree. I think she's the first time Bond has sort of met his match. I mean, not necessarily physically, but like that's sort of what they're riffing on, is this idea of like giving him a female companion that is able to fend for themselves for the first time. I'm curious though, Nate. Did you pick up that she's meant to be a lesbian?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, interesting.
Absolutely. I mean, it's 1964, so on film, that's very, like, below the surface, but her name is obviously... It's meant to be a reference to her lesbianism, I think, not necessarily to her physical appearance or whatever, right? So, like, that's your first tip-off, but then also she has, like, this troupe of female pilots, right, who are sort of, like... in like skin tight costumes. And I feel like there's maybe a couple like double entendres or sort of hints in the dialogue as well, that's how you're supposed to read it. But also just like her strength on screen at the time was read as kind of butch, right? And so I think that that's also supposed to be a tip off that maybe she's a lesbian.
But with enough power kissing from Sean Connery, she turns, because of course she does, because it's the 60s and misogyny.
Yeah, that's the worst. That is the worst part of this movie.
But if you think that's bad, let me just read this. So in the original novel, oh God, on the trip home, Pussy tells Bond she is only a lesbian and a criminal because as a child, her uncle raped her.
Oh, God.
Then they make love. And that's how the book ends. So, yes, it's, again, Fleming's relationship with lesbian. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there that we're not going to get into, but he had a very clear problem with misogyny to begin with, but an even greater problem with this idea of lesbianism.
Oh, my God.
Again, the guy is not he's a horrible guy, but it was the style at the time, as Grandpa says.
Yeah, I mean, I think, this goes back to that question of like, do we go back to the source material? It's like, it's still going to have to be massively adapted.
Yes.
It's just that you could massively adapt it differently than we did before.
Exactly.
So anyway. All right, Adam, we do have two more quote unquote Bond girls in this movie as well. Shirley Eaton as Jill Masterson and her sister on screen, Tanya Mallet, as Tilly Masterson. What are your thoughts?
I mean, again, this is... They're good. They serve their purpose, and their purpose is to be hot and then die. And that's unfortunate. That gets to the problem with these movies. And, you know, Shirley Eaton has a very iconic introduction, and then obviously one of the most iconic deaths in the series. Yeah. And Tanya Mallet has arguably like the most anticlimactic death in the entire series.
Indeed.
But that was also partly because they say in the commentary, Oddjob's hat was supposed to take her head cleanly off, but you can't really show that in 1960s cinema. So it just kind of looks like she gets knocked out. And then,
it doesn't look like she dies. That's kind of the problem with it, is that it's like it's not like the hat's even sticking out of her. It kind of like bops her, and then she just falls over.
Yeah. So it doesn't really work. But,
yeah.
I do want to talk a little bit more about actually Moneypenny, though, because she's an important female character in this, and I don't think Lois Maxwell gets enough credit for how good she is. Obviously, the sexual politics of Bond movies are questionable at best, but I've never really taken issue with the relationship between Bond and Moneypenny, because it's always... The way I read it is it's flirtatious, but harmless and consensual, and very much led by her. If you notice, she comes on to James and then he sort of plays along with it. It's very rarely the other way around. In the Brosnan era, the Samantha Bond Moneypenny starts to go a little too far and it gets really gross to a certain extent. But I think they really handle it really well with Lois Maxwell. And again, she's one of these up until the 80s and the Dalton era is, I think, when they finally replace her. She's one of those actors who stays consistent throughout the series. And kind of
Which is kind of interesting because it means the character ages while Bond doesn't, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Because Bond gets married in one of the films and she's there and she's crying at the wedding, and you read both ways into it of that. Like, she's upset because he's being married off, but she's also just happy for her friend. It's an interesting character that doesn't really get unpacked usually, but I think she works really, really well and is one of the better female elements in both this film and the series.
Yeah, totally. And of course, like, we get the whole MI6 crew here. We get M, we get Q. That's always fun stuff. That's a good chunk of like why Bond is fun, in my opinion. It's just seeing him get the briefing at the beginning, and like you get to see the gadgets, and you get these fun characters like Moneypenny, like Q, and maybe to a lesser extent M. But it's always a critical part of the formula, in my opinion.
Well, let's maybe unpack that, because that's one of the, for me, the highlights and maybe lowlights is that this is the film that sort of has established the formula. In that banned Criterion commentary, for lack of a better term, narrator, like, because they basically, all they've done is they've stitched together a bunch of interviews and then have like a narrator to sort of tie the threads together. But he describes the film as the first film in the series to provide the definitive template for subsequent productions to follow or play against, which I think is kind of an interesting distinction. But I wanted to know, Nate, like, how did it feel to you? Did you find it felt formulaic, or rather that it was working as that sort of baseline template?
Yeah, I mean, I think like part of the thing for me personally is that, like, again, my frame of reference is mostly like Connery, Brosnan, and Craig, right? And so I'm skipping the long middle, which I think people kind of forget, but like Brosnan was also a hard reboot in a certain way, and trying to like modernize Bond, make him like more 90s and all that kind of stuff. And so like both of those are very much playing off of this. And in a lot of ways, and maybe this is just my own misperception because I haven't seen as many of the middle movies, but like they seem to be more following the formula up until Brosnan. And then Brosnan tries to kind of change the character a little bit. Like, I think it's GoldenEye where Brosnan gets in the tank and like there's the tank chase.
Oh, yes.
Right. And it's like that was meant to be playing off of what you were expecting Bond to be like, right?
Yeah.
Of
well,
being
that's
like
that's
using brute force, which is not how Bond is supposed to be, right? Yeah. And so like for me, it doesn't feel formulaic because I've seen these like three very different takes on who Bond is.
Okay, interesting.
Whereas, yeah, it's like if you've seen all the Timothy Daltons and you've seen, I don't know, I feel like George Lazenby is maybe also his own thing.
Oh yeah, wow.
But like all those sort of like middle entries, I think this would feel a lot more formulaic because I think those are much more sticking to what's established here.
Totally.
But that's my outside read. I'd be curious how you feel about the formula part of it.
I mean, again, it's establishing the formula, but that's what I was surprised by in my rewatch was how engaged I was in it, because while it's establishing the formula, it doesn't necessarily feel formulaic. The beats are being established, and obviously I've watched these so many times and in so many different orders, but like it's kind of interesting because you're starting to see, oh, okay, this is that beat becoming established. That's this beat coming established. For example, the first Q branch scene, which I want to talk about a little bit more, but like things like that, it's interesting to sort of see how they start and then how they evolve. Let's talk about gadgets. Like, did you have a favorite gadget in the film? Because this is like probably the most gadget heavy entry for a while.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, I love the gadgets. My favorite one is the very, very first one in the film. It's giving the audience a message about what kind of movie this is going to be and how it's different from what's come before. So, the very first time we see Bond on screen, what we actually see is a little seagull floating along the water, and then it rises up out of the water to reveal that James Bond is wearing it on his head as camouflage.
Yeah.
And it's so goofy. So goofy. It really goes into that sort of Roald Dahl-esque script writing that we talked about in that episode, where it's just like so bizarre. It almost goes into the kinds of gadgets that we see in the Mission Impossible series, which, as you know, like I'm maybe more of a Mission Impossible guy than a Bond guy.
Totally.
And so like they also kind of lean into that silliness in a way that I appreciate. It's such a delicate balance. This is why I love Brad Bird, is because he's able to strike that perfect balance of being like, it's funny, but it's also cool.
Yes.
So anyway, I love that very first gadget. And then, I have to shout out, because we just did Ben-Hur on the podcast, the Ben-Hur wheels, right?
Right.
The Aston Martin has the spiky wheels, which on the commentary, Guy Hamilton confirms is a reference to Ben-Hur specifically. So got to shout that out.
Very cool, yeah.
Yeah. What about you?
I mean, as a kid, it was the car, basically. Just that whole car I wanted. But I remember being so fascinated by the idea of like the GPS tracker, which it wasn't called GPS at the time, but like essentially the GPS tracker, the little radio responder that he puts in his shoe, which obviously, in Skyfall, they make reference to the fact that like he basically gets a gun and a radio, which is sort of a callback. And then of course, famously, ultimately ends up in the Aston Martin later on in that film as well. The ejector seat, like it's just, for me, it's the car. The car is the coolest, is still the coolest. It's this blend of like, let's take something practical and then miniaturize it or put it in something that is unexpected. And obviously, like, again, things like Get Smart will riff on this, like having the shoe phone and stuff like that. But, and they do get really silly in some of the later entries.
Well, it's an arms race, right? It's like, this is part of the problem. And it's kind of what happens with The Simpsons as well, where it's like, okay, well, we've done all of those things and everyone's expecting that we're going to have something new.
Yeah.
So like, how do we amp it up even further?
And that's where I think it works here, is that like, it's new enough that everything feels like unique and kind of surprising, but like grounded and practical for a spy versus like later on when it just gets so absurd and also feels like, oh, well, you only have this so that we can have a set piece that will take advantage of it. Like,
right.
So
where it's like literally it's like a key in a keyhole, where it's like this one gadget that does a very, very specific thing that of course is going to come in handy later.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's problematic.
We're not quite there yet, which is good.
Yeah, totally. I was listening to the commentary, and one of the things that struck me that was interesting and speaks to the Eon Productions versus director conversation was just that Hamilton's instinct was very much to be like, no, we can't show the audience everything that Aston Martin can do up front, because then it'll ruin the surprise. And Cubby, I think, was basically like, no. In the Q scene, you need to show everything it can do. That's a very important thing, because it kind of like sets up a payoff instead of a surprise.
It's Chekhov's Aston Martin.
Yeah, exactly. And, as it turns out, of course, Cubby was absolutely right. And it becomes, again, part of the formula, right? You have to do it in every Bond thing, where you find out what all of the different gadgets are going to be, and you can kind of imagine and salivate over how they're going to get used later in the story.
Yeah, totally.
And it totally works. Coming back to The Simpsons for a moment, gadgets are actually weirdly a huge way that I feel like The Simpsons borrows from this movie, the Bond series in general. But the other interesting thing that they do is that they love gadgets. They mash them up with all of these other sources of gadgetry. So it's like Goldfinger and Bond, obviously.
Yeah.
Batman 66, right?
Yeah.
Has its share of different types of gadgets and layers and fire poles and all that
Which
kind
I'm
of stuff.
sure is riffing on this and the success of this and that idea.
Yep, exactly. Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's true, eh?
Yeah, it has a lot of things, the tubes and like different kind of the like wonder of gadgetry and all of that kind of stuff. And then, of course, you get like Get Smart and Mission Impossible, really the TV series more so. But like those also come into it in their sort of like most ridiculous and expressive versions of gadgetry. But like, it's just interesting that The Simpsons is kind of mixing all of that stuff together, and it becomes almost its own thing, but that it's part of the DNA of the show, really.
Yeah. Well, and I wanted to ask you as well, like staying on the gadget idea, like, this is our first true Q branch scene. Desmond Llewellyn plays that character in From Russia with Love, but he shows up and delivers the attaché case, which is the cheap, lame gadget. But that's the one gadget you get in that movie. But this is the first time you're in Q's lab and he's sort of showing his stuff off. How old do you think he is?
It's tough because everyone smoked. I have no idea if Desmond Llewellyn smoked, but everyone looks older than they are. So I know that. But also, I've got to say he's like, okay, let's say he's in his 50s.
He's 55.
Okay, I was right. Like, you just like take like 10 years off, and that's like, you know,
which is crazy though, because he stays in the Bond series up until The World Is Not Enough,
right?
And he only stops being in them because he unfortunately tragically passes away at the age of 85, 3 weeks after the movie's premiere.
Wow.
And not because he was like sick, he was in a car accident and sustained injuries that he passed away from, but like theoretically could have kept going. Like,
yeah. And he's so great. He's great in all of those movies, and his dynamic with Bond is so good.
And this is what I thought was so fascinating was I was reading in I think it's in my book, or I don't remember exactly. I read a bunch of different sources throughout this, but originally he played the scene as though he was excited and happy to see Bond. You know, this suave super spy and like, you know, oh my God, James Bond is in my lap. And Hamilton came up to him and said, no. You don't like this guy at all. Like, he doesn't respect your gadgets. And from that point on, the sort of ornery back and forth between Bond and Q was sort of established. And I just think that, so like, again, you got to give credit to Hamilton. Like, he's responsible for creating that dynamic that is sustained throughout the rest of the series. Right. And I think that's where Hamilton does deserve some more credit, is like, he's sort of smart at finding these things that are going to become trademarks of the series alongside Broccoli and well, maybe to a lesser degree, Saltzman.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I did actually have another question that this is something that came up in a different Bond movie, but I don't think we're ever going to talk about it, so I'm going to talk about it here.
Sure.
So in some of the later movies, I think starting with Your Eyes Only, Q has an assistant. Do you recall the name of the assistant?
I don't. I feel like it was... Is it a double entendre?
It's not. It's Smithers.
Oh.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
And he only goes by Smithers, and he's the guy who's always testing the stuff that Q invents to disastrous effect. He's usually trying to like avoid getting killed.
Right.
But I was wondering, like, I've been thinking about this more and more. I watched Repo Man last night.
Oh.
Which is a movie that, again, on the commentary for The Simpsons, they talk about like, oh, this was like so influential on us. We like love this movie. And you know what the name of the main character is in that?
Smithers?
Otto.
Otto.
O-T-T-O.
Okay.
And he plays a punk. Like, that's like, that gets recruited by the Repo Man. So I was like, okay, we know they like this. We know there's a character on The Simpsons called Otto. Like, is he named after that? Same sort of thing here, where I'm like, Smithers, like, is that where they get Smithers? Is it's like, we need a name for an assistant. We love James Bond. Do we name it after the James Bond assistant? You know, it's just like one of those things, especially because he only goes by Smithers. Yeah. And Smithers on The Simpsons also only goes by Smithers. But anyway, so that's a big question mark, but a little rabbit hole I went down with this.
Well, there's still so much to unpack, but one of the main things I wanted to talk about, because it's the thing that I didn't know as a kid and only found out in later years, and then made me appreciate this movie so much more. But it's the imperceptible technical craft is the way I've sort of decided to phrase it. What is shocking about this movie is how much like invisible technical flexing is going on, and you would never necessarily know it until you're told. So I first want to talk about the Miami sequence.
Okay.
The thing you maybe don't necessarily realize is that it is a combination of location footage that was shot without any of the main actors, and then on-set photography, which combines sets and rear screen projection. And basically it was up to Peter Hunt, the editor, to try and take all of this stuff that was shot like months apart and fit it all back together and make it work. And he said it was very, very challenging.
No kidding.
I just want to shout him out because he would eventually get promoted to director for On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which many people consider to be the best of the original series. I personally don't love it because I think it suffers because of George Lazenby, but I will give it credit because it is especially known for its like unique visual style and its very frenetic modern editing, which was something that Hunt was really starting to introduce in these early films. So like he really needs to get credit for making this like massive puzzle work. But like when you watch those sequences, you would have no idea that like Goldfinger is not in Miami, Sean Connery is not in Miami, and that scene where Goldfinger is playing cards, the opponent was shot in Miami and Goldfinger was shot on a soundstage in London.
Right. Because like Felix, who's an American, is the character Felix, I should say.
Yes, I was gonna say, 'cause he's
is
played
in
by a
Miami,
Canadian.
but he's like the only one, and everyone else is double. It's totally crazy. Like for them to even be able to plan that out properly and not get screwed over later. And I think there was a little bit of that. Like they had to make up some stuff, but like just, yeah, totally amazing. It works at all, to be honest.
Yeah, it's, in my opinion, totally imperceptible. And even once you know about it, like I was looking out for it because usually like rear screen projection is usually pretty noticeable in these, like especially like in driving sequences. But I think that entire sequence, you would have no idea that it's two completely different locations, like hundreds of thousands of miles apart, shot months apart.
Totally.
It's wild.
Similarly, you know, I was listening on the commentary. Peter Hunt is pretty cheeky on the commentary.
Yes.
I wonder if he's one of the reasons why
I think he is the reason that they got banned.
Yeah, but he was talking about the golf scene and kind of like throwing some shade at Hamilton a little bit, where apparently all they had done in that scene is they had shot Oddjob throwing his hat off screen, and that's it.
Oh.
They didn't shoot the pickup of the hat actually chopping off the statue's head. And Peter Hunt had to go and do that in studio later and then cut it in.
Wow.
Which is just like, wow. I mean, it's hard to wrap your head around not planning for that. But also, yeah, Peter Hunt's the reason why that shot exists. So that's pretty cool.
I mean, again, it's so unfortunate that he only gets to direct one movie and the movie ultimately doesn't do very well. And I think that's entirely due to the casting, not because of the filmmaking. He really is the unsung hero of these early films because without him, you don't get so many of these iconic moments. I also wanted to ask you, Nate, as another imperceptible thing, did you notice anything peculiar about Goldfinger's performance?
So, okay, I did not notice it, but I did find out what you're alluding to. But go for it. Please explain, because it is wild.
So, they cast Gert Frobe based on his performance in that earlier film we alluded to. And Guy Hamilton was under the impression that he could speak English. His agent was like, yeah, his English was flawless. Shows up to set, and he's like, hello, Mr. Hamilton. And Hamilton says that within 2 or 3 sentences, he's aware this guy does not speak a word of English. And so Goldfinger, throughout the entire film, is dubbed by another actor.
Yes.
And I think it is perhaps the best example of dubbing in a film ever, because it is flawless.
Yep, totally. And especially, so again, they were explaining a little bit like how this works and what they decided, because there's always going to be a trade-off with like dubbing like this, right? Mm-hmm. And so what they decided was the words didn't really matter. So Gert Frobe on set is kind of speaking gibberish, and they were basically like, what really matters is how fast his lips are moving and the sort of like tone of the performance and the length. And so they focused on that and just let him kind of say whatever he was going to say, and it didn't really matter. Instead of saying like, no, you have to say the words in the script and then we'll dub it later so it sounds better, they did not take that approach. So I thought that was fascinating, especially because, like you said, like you wouldn't necessarily know, like the lip, you don't look at the lips and be like, oh, that's not what he's saying. It's like, it's not the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah, for me, it's not even that. It's just like, usually when you do ADR overdubs, like there's this sort of disconnect between the way the on-set sound recording sounds versus the in-studio sound recording, and it can be very difficult to match them. It's one of the reasons why when movie musicals are done poorly, it drives me insane, because it's like you can always tell when they've cut to the playback track, because like all of a sudden the vocal performance and vocal clarity is completely different from the on-set dialogue.
Right.
And here it's flawless. Like Sean Connery's on-set recording mixes beautifully with all of this ADR. And the thing is, this is apparently, they were doing this a lot in these movies because, as I alluded to, they would usually hire, especially for the women, they were hire these women from, European countries where English is not their first language, and therefore their English is terrible, and they have to dub them with like English ladies. Yeah. And when you know that, you go back and you watch and you're like, oh, actually, okay, yes, I do kind of notice that maybe sounds a little too clear. Like it's not matching perfectly with like the on-set dialogue or on-location dialogue. But here, it is flawless. It is
You'd never know unless you read the trivia.
Exactly. And that's the thing. I watched this movie so many times growing up, and it wasn't until I was like in university and finally found that fact out, and I was like, no, that can't be true. And you go back and you watch it and you're like, if that's true, and it clearly is, it is incredibly well done. And that's why for it to be nominated for Best Sound, like I wonder if that's what the Best Sound it's not like because it has great sound effects, it's because they did this incredible overdub job that is absolutely flawless.
Totally. Well, Adam, why don't we talk a little bit about some of the big set pieces in the movie, because I feel like that's kind of what's left, is like there are just these like really iconic scenes that lead to the big finale. So why don't we talk a little bit about the Alps, right? So there's this car chase that goes through the Alps. There's a whole bunch of different elements to it. There's like the shooting scene. There's like the running off the road, the Ben-Hur wheels, like all of that kind of stuff. But it's interesting. I was reading on the trivia. They apparently actually provided access to the press for this entire shoot.
Oh, cool.
So there was a 7-day shoot in the Alps. They let people have like unprecedented access to all the behind the scenes stuff, talking to the actors. It like generated all this buzz about the movie. So that's part of the whole like promotion aspect of this, to the point where it's like it was very unpolished. Like there were shots of Sean Connery arriving at the airport without his toupee. Right?
Yes.
And like all sorts of like, you know, sort of behind the scenes rumors about like who's sleeping with whom and, you know, all that sort of stuff that would be very faux pas right now, would never ever happen.
You would never let that happen now.
Right. But it did help to contribute to the sort of myth of this movie, which is kind of interesting. In the same article I was reading about this, they were sort of saying like, yeah, this is like one of the quintessential scenes in the movie that really sets the tone for Bond and sort of the globe-trotting nature of the movie. And I was like, is it though? I mean, I don't think that sequence is particularly exciting. Maybe at the time it felt a little different, but it's not my favorite moment in this. And again, it's a movie that has a lot of very cool sequences that are pretty iconic, but I was surprised to see that one sort of singled out. So any thoughts on the car chase?
Well, I think it speaks to my previous review of when I said it was a slog. I would agree in that, like, outside of the Ben-Hur moment, I don't remember this at all. It's when he goes back to Goldfinger's lair at night, and then there's the second car chase in that sequence.
Right.
That is more memorable to me, mostly because, like, that's where the ejector seat happens, and that's where eventually he gets busted. But the thing with Tilly and, like, all that, it feels too shoe leathery to me.
It feels more like the first two movies to me.
Yeah, I don't know. It does nothing for me. And it kind of introduces this character that, because of the way her death is handled, this is the thing in the book, it becomes a much bigger, like, Tilly is there for a lot longer, I'm pretty sure, and like it becomes sort of motivation for Bond to continue is her death, and then also finding out about her sister's death. Whereas in this movie, it's like there's no real reason for them to team up, there's no real payoff from them teaming up, and like, I don't want to be crude, but it's like he doesn't even sleep with her. So what's the point of this character, really? Like,
it's true.
Because you don't really get the motivation of, like, in the novel, he finds out that her sister has been murdered, and because he has slept with her and sort of forms a bond with her early on in the book, that becomes plot motivation for continuing. Whereas here, we already know she's dead. The sister shows up, so it's not like she's providing this information to it. It's just, I don't really understand the purpose outside of, like, we just need another set piece.
Right. And the set piece is not as good as it could be. It's not as tight as it could be. It goes on for a really long time.
You get rear screen projection driving. Like,
Yeah. The one really cool shot is the double pullback. Did you catch this? You get a shot of, like, Goldfinger and Oddjob are, like, at their car at a rest stop.
Oh,
and,
yes.
And it pulls back, and then you see Bond watching them, and then it pulls back again, and you get the sniper ready to shoot Bond. That's a very, very cool shot. But yeah, other than that, I kind of agree. It's not the most interesting. So this is where one of the, like, mystery Simpsons references is for me.
Okay.
The episode Honka Honka Burns in Love, where basically Burns falls in love with this young woman. She has a very cool car in that episode. I think it's the car from this sequence.
Interesting. Okay.
It's very, very close. There are definitely some, like, little details that are different, but it is a white car with a red interior, which is very striking.
Yeah.
And it feels like it could definitely be a reference to Tilly Masterson's car from this sequence. But it could also just be like, you know, I know they have animators on staff that just love cars, so maybe it's a completely different car. But I was curious about that one, and it's one of those ones that's a little hard to confirm. So anyway.
Well, obviously, I think we have to talk about the most iconic moment in the film. The set piece that I think does actually work really, really well, which is obviously the laser sequence. I mean, top 10 most iconic James Bond moments, this is going to be number one. This is the thing. Outside of maybe him being like Bond, James Bond, or Shaken Not Stirred. Like, this is the thing everybody thinks of.
Right. And parodied in multiple Simpsons episodes, right? You Only Move Twice. That's why we talked about it in that episode. There is the whole, like, laser sequence with Scorpio.
Sure, do you expect me to talk?
I don't expect anything from you except to die and be a very cheap funeral.
It's also parodied in Cape Fear in an Itchy and Scratchy episode. And then it may also be parodied in the very, very first episode of the show, which is when Bart is getting his tattoo removed, and the laser looks a hell of a lot like
for sure.
the laser from this scene. Bart's also strapped down with like these big metal clamps that kind of are reminiscent of that.
Ay, caramba!
Now, whatever you do, boy, don't squirm. You don't want to get this sucker near your eye or your groin.
It's not like a shot-for-shot remake, but it definitely feels like it's kind of playing off of the language of the scene.
Yeah.
But Adam, I was curious, like as you say, this is like one of the most iconic scenes in probably the whole series. One of the most iconic scenes in cinema, honestly. So what is it about the scene that makes it so iconically Bondian for you?
That's a good question. I think it's this idea of Bond finds himself in a position where you're not sure how he's going to make it out of it. And in subsequent films, usually he ultimately relies on a gadget or he manages to escape of his own volition. And here, what I think is kind of interesting is he really just kind of like talks his way out of it. So that's where it's almost like unlike the rest of the series.
Well, like even in the Simpsons parody in You Only Move Twice, he takes a quarter out of his pocket and flips it into the air, which splits the laser into 4 and then frees him, right?
Well, and
that's what you'd kind of expect.
Yeah, and like you look at a movie like Spectre, which is obviously riffing on this, when Christoph Waltz is going to drill into his brain and he's talking to Madeline Swan and then uses the explosive watch that he happened to get to free himself and stuff like that. So like that's usually how it works out. Whereas here, like I think why the scene works so well for me, whether or not this is why it makes it iconically Bondian, but I think what makes it work so well for me is that Connery is really good here. And it's one of the few rare times where you see genuine panic from Bond. You watch, and that laser's getting closer and closer and closer to him, and he's like, this might be it. Like, I might actually not make it out of this. And that never really happens again. He always is always like calm, cool, and collected. So it's kind of interesting that you get to see him in a moment where he genuinely thinks this is it, and then manages to talk his way to safety.
Yeah. This is, again, the thing that I think that Mission Impossible does a little better is that, sorry, but particularly from like the fourth movie moving on, is like there are many moments in that where Ethan Hunt looks terrified. And like he's like, I am going to die, but I'm going to do this anyways because it has to happen, right? And like, I think that's actually the thing that Brad Bird, in a lot of ways, adds to the series, is those sorts of moments where he acknowledges that he's about to do something crazy and then does it anyways. Yeah. And you see that real fear and that moment of being overwhelmed, and then he does it. And that's exciting to watch on film, I think. So this definitely has that vibe.
And I think the other thing, too, is like, and we alluded to it in how Maybaum changed it, but like it is paying homage to these sort of moments from cinema history, cinema past. Right. The girl on the train tracks or the guy tied in front of the buzzsaw, which is what it was originally. Like, this is sort of a trope, I guess you could say. Yeah. It's a modern take on that old trope. Yeah. And that also makes it kind of interesting. It's like, how is it taking it and turning it on its head? This thing we've seen a million times. How are we changing it up?
Yeah, I was definitely this time, partly because of my rabbit hole about gadgets and how The Simpsons mixes all these different sources of gadgets together. I was thinking a lot about Batman 66, which of course did have those cliffhangers and did have, like, I'm sure there's at least one with a buzzsaw. And I think it's because, as you say, they're both pulling from these old film serials. But the big difference here is there is no cliffhanger. It resolves the cliffhanger within the movie, which is very interesting that they're able to pull that off. Because you'd sort of think, like, well, a cliffhanger only works if you don't get the resolution immediately. That's the whole thing. But it manages to give you that same feeling of like, how is he going to get out of this one? Yeah. It made me think of like a lot of mystery novels. Like the best mystery novels are really good about this, where it's like, you know, the chapter ends totally on a cliffhanger, but then like you can just keep reading. It's a page turner. Like that's kind of the vibe of the scene. It just makes you want to keep going. So
well, it's interesting too. While he's doing a little bit of monologuing, you're not getting the full exposition dump out of Goldfinger like you do sort of in later, or like that's sort of the joke that everybody says Bond movies do. Whereas here, it's very clear like that's not actually what's happening.
I mean the most famous line from the scene is specifically saying,
"Do you expect me to talk?" No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die.
Yeah, exactly. It works so well. It still works so well. And there's a reason why it's the scene that has been parodied ad nauseum, because it works. You know, if you're going to steal from the best.
Yeah, totally. Well, let's talk about the finale.
Yeah. I was going to say, speaking of the best or worst.
Yeah. So Fort Knox. Let's start with Fort Knox. I mean, Fort Knox occupies this massive place in pop culture for me, where it's like a place that I heard about as a kid, like all the time.
Right.
And it must be because of this movie. Like, it's obviously a place that existed long before that, and it's sort of like an important American institution of sorts. But like the idea of stealing from Fort Knox was in every kid's cartoon. It was like all over the place in the 90s.
Right.
And it must be because it's riffing off of this movie and the Goldfinger plot to like irradiate the gold or whatever.
Yeah.
But I did go down this rabbit hole a little bit of just like, what is Fort Knox? And it is the place where America keeps its gold. Apparently, at the time, the president of the United States was not allowed to be in Fort Knox.
Right.
And like, it was so secretive that even the commander-in-chief was not allowed to be inside. They never got to see inside either. They had no idea what the interior of Fort Knox was like. So, of course, Ken Adam, the great Ken Adam, who we talked about, again, a lot in both You Only Live Twice, but also in Dr. Strangelove, he just basically made up the interior entirely, and it's not realistic at all, which he acknowledged. There would be no elevators. There would be no tall stacks of gold, because if you stack it up that high, it becomes unbelievably heavy.
Yeah, it would just crush the gold, and then it would just fall through the floor.
Right. So it was interesting that it was that secure. And then, of course, this all changed. So in 1974, apparently, there was a big conspiracy theory from this guy, Peter Better or Peter Beater, I'm not sure. He was like a politician and just a total wanker who basically developed this whole conspiracy that the gold in Fort Knox had been stolen by European interests because of, the Rockefeller family and the Bolshevik Zionist Axis, which you can kind of guess where this is going.
Yep.
Big racist, Jewish global conspiracy bullshit. So anyway, he fed this whole thing, and Congress actually did a delegation to Fort Knox and went inside for the first time to inspect the gold. Unsurprisingly, same thing happened in 2017 under the first Trump administration. Now, of course, that's happening again. Trump is saying we need to go inspect the gold again. Again, he already did this in his first administration, so I don't really get it. But there's this whole conspiracy thing that's sort of like tied up in Fort Knox. So it just occupies this huge thing in pop culture from like my childhood all the way to the present. So it's a great idea. Now, does the finale live up to that great idea? Adam, what do you think?
I don't know. I mean, again, this is one of those classic things of like, is it just because it's been done better subsequently? This isn't the first time we see like a bunch of henchmen descend on a base and then like a bunch of heroes descend on a base. Like You Only Live Twice has a very similar finale. It's just in a more grand scale. And that
arguably a better finale. I
think it does it better. Yeah. But then I think it's The Spy Who Loved Me literally does the exact same thing, only it's in like a submarine. Like it's just, they just keep coming back to this over and over again and trying to like just do it bigger and better. I think my problem with the finale is more the like hat on a hat element of it, in that like we get this whole finale, Goldfinger escapes, and then we have the like second climax on the plane and how they dispose of Goldfinger by having him sucked out a window.
Oh,
and
interesting.
Then, like
I like that part personally. That's interesting.
Well, it's just the fact that we get like it's happening twice, right? Like this, I think this film does suffer from some pacing issues. And interestingly, Peter Hunt apparently said he was editing from both ends. Like basically, he had the beginning of the movie and the end of the movie, but all the stuff that happened in the middle came very late in the game. And he's like, if I had another week on this movie, it would have been perfect, but I just didn't get it. So, and I totally feel that. Like when you know that, you're like, okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Right.
But yeah,
the interminable golf game in the middle.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it's the worst part of the movie. Like, let's take the least exciting sport ever and make an action set piece out of it. Anyway.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. Like there are elements in the finale I like. I think the final odd job fight is kind of interesting, especially how that whole thing plays out without score. The final way they dispatch of him is really cool. And then you've got like the countdown to the dirty bomb, which like is this other added aspect to sort of add some stakes and tension to it. But then the payoff is literally a guy just walks in and turns it off. Like that's my problem with this whole finale. Is just like everything sort of, as Homer says, everything is wrapped up in a neat little package, and like that feels unsatisfying.
I just, to be honest, like I love Ken Adam. I found the set really boring. The bomb is one of those things where it's like, maybe this is one of the first times that we would see this on screen, but now that has been done so many times.
Yeah, exactly.
That's maybe the only part that you feel the formulaicness, even though it may have created the formula.
I literally rewatched MacGruber for the first time in like 10 years the other week, and like they do that. Like we keep doing this over and over again. So again, you got to give it some grace that it might have been the first time. It's a trope for a reason, but like it doesn't make it any less tropey. So
yeah, for sure. And of course, it ends on 007. The timer like stops on 007, which is a nice touch. Apparently, that was a Saltzman edition.
Oh, well, now this is interesting because I read, and again, I can't verify this because there's no actual way to verify this, but allegedly in the original theatrical prints, it didn't end at 007. It ended at like 003. And then when they went back and made some changes for the international market or whatever, they made a couple tweaks to the film. And I guess at that point, allegedly, that's when they said we should have it end on 007.
Right. On the commentary, they do say it's Saltzman, but they don't say when it came in.
Yeah,
so that's
and again, I can't verify that because I obviously don't have access to an original theatrical print. But that's one of those things that the first time you do it is kind of fun and clever, but then
becomes so corny so quickly.
By the 90s, you're like, oh my God.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
It's eye-rollingly bad.
Yeah, exactly. That moment is parodied in Homer Defined when Homer sort of averts a crisis at the nuclear power plant. But I actually like the double ending because I think it subverts your expectations of being like, oh, good, he saved the day, everything's great, getting on an airplane. And then it's that last like jump scare basically of being like, oh no, it's actually a trap. And it resolves fairly quickly. So like I didn't mind that part. It feels like a hat on a hat because the finale right before it, I think, is actually the thing that is not working.
Exactly.
It's a little
and then,
slow.
You know, you get a power kiss. She's no longer a lesbian. James Bond will return in Thunderball.
All right, Adam, let's do a Simpsons speed round on this. And I know we have a limited time, so it's going to be a true speed round on this time. Firstly, are there any moments in this movie that feel like Simpsons jokes but aren't?
I have this in my notes. I hope the sex was better than the food. It looks awful, not unlike the meals the Simpsons eat. So I'm talking about the scene where Bond goes back to the hotel room with Jill Masterson, and then they like have their little affair before she's turned into Gold Lady. Whatever food they ordered, it looks like inedible. Yeah, it looks like Simpsons food. And then the other thing is when the gangsters keep chattering during Goldfinger's plot, it reminds me so much of the townspeople. Like, the taxes! The finger thing means the taxes! Like, it's just got this very Simpsons town mentality. So those are my two picks.
I like that.
Nate, did you learn anything about The Simpsons from this movie?
Yes. Okay, so on the commentary, they talk about this idea of pulling the balloon down is what they describe it as. And it reminded me so much of Matt Groening's idea of the elastic band reality. And so basically what their point is that like you can kind of go further and further in like the goofy or unbelievable or fantastical direction, but then you have to quote unquote pull the balloon down back to reality. So their example is actually the like car chase that you were talking about where they're like at the base and you get the ejector seat and like all the gadgets and stuff, and Tilly and Bond are having fun, and then right after that is when she gets killed. And so it's cool that they are thinking about that same thing as Matt Groening is about the show.
Totally.
All right, Adam, does this movie still have some juice for more Simpsons parodies?
No, I think they've sort of wrung it through the ringer. I mean, you know, James Bond as a whole, maybe, but I think this movie, you've pretty much done everything you can, so I would say no.
Right, yeah. You don't want to do an Alpine car chase?
No, not so much.
Okay.
Nate, are there any characters in this movie that could become recurring Simpsons side characters?
Oh, okay. Definitely Pussy Galore. That was my pick. Again, like, see Catwoman from Batman 66. I think The Simpsons could really use a side character that's like giving that like Eartha Kitt / Pussy Galore sort of energy on the show. And I think it would be a lot of fun.
I do have to say, the little old lady with a machine gun that we mentioned earlier really gives me Mole Man vibes.
Also like, a good shout. Yes.
That scene where I don't remember the context, but he's like got a sword for some reason. That reminds me of her.
For sure. Okay, Adam, are there other movies by this director or in this franchise that The Simpsons should parody?
I mean, not necessarily by this director, but obviously in the James Bond franchise. I feel like Moonraker, The Simpsons Go to Space.
Okay,
you know, like
again.
That feels like, well, okay. Oh yeah, I guess Homer did go to space. Well, but the whole family did. Well, outside of that Treehouse of Horror episode with Rosie O'Donnell and Spike Lee, but You've got 25 films to pull from. I'm sure you can find something.
I was thinking blaxploitation with Live and Let Die. Could the Simpsons pull it off?
Fair enough.
I don't know.
Well, Nate, that brings us to our final verdicts. Do you think the strengths outweigh the weaknesses? Would you recommend this film?
Obviously, I do think that the strengths outweigh the weaknesses. Again, I will say I think there are better Bond movies in the series for me. I'm a big fan of the Craig series. I think it often strikes the right tone. I love Casino Royale. That would be probably my pick of the series overall, but there are lots of good options. But you have to give credit for this. This is the first, right? In a lot of ways. Not the first in the series, but the first to create so many aspects of the formula that we still love today. So, yes. Totally. And I would recommend you go check it out if you have not seen it, of course. What about you, Adam?
Yeah, I 100% agree. As I said, I went into it kind of hesitant, being like, these older movies are sometimes of a slog. And I'm more forgiving than maybe some people are of the, elements that have aged poorly, because again, it's history. I don't want them to go back and re-edit these and re-edit all that stuff out. That's how it happened. That's how it was. It's reflective of the time. But I was surprised at how entertained and actually plugged into the movie I was. I really, really was sort of vibing with it and actually kind of paying attention to the plot for the first time in a long... Normally when I rewatch these movies, I can multitask or just I'm dipping in and out because I've seen them so many times, and you don't have to totally engaged, but because I was taking notes, I really was totally engaged.
Yeah.
And was surprised at how much more I enjoyed it by actually being engaged in the film. So I agree. Would I introduce Jamie to James Bond via Goldfinger like my dad did? No, probably not. I'd probably just do the Craig series, and if he's into it, then we could go back to the beginning. But
totally.
I think that's the way to do it, is if you really want to see how the series evolved, this is a good place to maybe try an older one with someone, and if they vibe with this, then you're like, okay, now let's watch the rest of it. If they're like, oh no, this is too old and dated, then just stick with the Craigs. But
yeah, totally. Which actually does speak to the quality of the Craigs, because you wouldn't necessarily do that with Star Wars.
Exactly.
You'd still do the original trilogy probably if you're introducing it to someone, and then you can go from there. But
totally
fascinating. All right, Adam, what about extra credit? What movie would you pair with this?
Well, we've sort of danced around this idea a little bit, but I'm picking Mission Impossible 3. And not because I think Mission Impossible 3 is the best of the Mission Impossibles. In fact, I don't really like it that much. Mm-hmm. But I think it's important in the way Goldfinger was important, in that it then sort of sets the blueprint for the direction of the series moving forward. You could make the argument that Ghost Protocol is more setting the template, but when you go back and I did this last summer, I think it was, I rewatched all of them. If you look at Mission Impossible 1 and Mission Impossible 2 and what they are, and then how 3 sort of takes it into a more campy direction and a more fun, Bondy, gadget heavy. The first movie is trying to be as far away from James Bond as possible, I would argue.
And the second movie is a John Woo movie.
The second movie is a John Woo action movie. So the third one is really sort of establishing it. And again, Goldfinger's the third. So I think Mission Impossible 3 would be my choice. But really any of those movies, we are big fans on this show, so you could watch any of them. But I think pairing those two would make for an interesting double feature. What about you?
You and I went in the exact same direction. So my pick is similarly Iron Man 2008 for the same reasons, which is it's a movie that set a template for a long-running series. Right. And all of the sort of key ingredients of that series can be found in that movie, even though it's imperfect and it's the first try at it and all of that, but it did such an incredible job of kind of kicking off this whole franchise, which of course, much like Bond, is now going through its growing pains and trying to figure out how does it reboot, reset, reinvent itself for a new age, how does it lead again instead of following, all of those same kinds of questions, but had a really good run, at least, much like Bond did. So I think that that's another really interesting one where you could kind of see the formula being built in process, and it is also a fun movie. So
totally.
That's great. And then, of course, I will always shout out Brad Bird, who clearly is a huge fan of this type of movie and kind of riffing on that, and I think is so good at crystallizing what makes it work. So you could, of course, do Mission Impossible 4 Ghost Protocol. You could also do The Incredibles, which is really riffing off of Bond and maybe particularly this movie in certain ways. So those would be my picks.
I recently rewatched The Incredibles during the pandemic, and you can tell that it's a love letter to these early Bond films. Especially the score is paying a lot of tribute to
so good.
The John Barry scores. So that's a great pick.
And again, much like The Simpsons, it's that brassy version of the Bond score that it wants. That's from this movie.
Totally. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of the Springfield Googolplex, the movie podcast for Simpson fans, and the end of this season, actually. If you enjoyed what you heard, please leave us a review and share this episode with the Simpson fans and film buffs in your life. We've also set up a support page on our website where, if you want, you can throw us a couple of bucks to help cover the cost of making this show. Every little bit helps, and we really appreciate it. And as I mentioned, this is the end of this season for now, but don't worry, much like James Bond will return, the Springfield Googolplex will return with, and this is one of those rare cases we get to say, Who Shot Mr. Burns? Part 2. But we won't reveal what film we're doing because I think that's going to be a fun little surprise. You know, you got to tease you a little bit. So we've got a great episode lined up, a great guest lined up. So until next time, Nate.
We'll see you around the Plex.
Nate Story. He's the man with the nicest beard. Anyway, a spider's beard. I mean, it really, it's so good. It's so good.
It is. It's the best.
Yeah, it is. I think it might be the best. I think it might be the best. Although I do also really like, I mean, it doesn't count because there's no lyrics or anything, but Dr. No, the James Bond theme.
Sure. Oh, well, yeah. You got to give credit to the OG.
Anyway. Okay, here we go. In 3, 2, 1. Ho!